The strap on the camera at Station 41 was cinched backward. I stood there in the wet dark with my headlamp on the low setting and looked at it for a while before I did anything about it. It was a 2-inch nylon strap with a cam buckle, the kind you use to hold a camera housing against a tree without driving screws into the bark, and I had put that strap on myself in April. I am left-handed. When I run a strap through a cam buckle, I run it from the right side, and the tail comes out the left, and I fold the tail back on itself and tuck it under the loop so it does not flap in the wind and spook things. 9 years of doing it. My hands do it without me. The strap ran the other way. The tail came out the right side and hung loose. I remember thinking, plain as a grocery list, that I must have done it in a hurry. That is what a man thinks at 4 a.m. in October with rain coming down the back of his collar. He thinks he must have done it in a hurry, and he thinks about his coffee cooling in the truck, and he pops the housing open and pulls the card and puts a fresh one in and cinches the strap the way he likes it and walks on to the next station. That is exactly what I did. I want that on the record, because everything that came after starts there. I fixed the strap. I did not photograph it. I did not write it down. I stood in front of the first honest thing that country ever tried to tell me, and I put it back the way I liked it, and I walked away. My name is not important to this, but I was called Boyd by everybody who worked with me, and I will keep that. I was a wildlife technician on a camera grid in the Eastern Olympics, in the Grey Wolf drainage in the country above it, running up under Baldy and Tyler Peak and out into the edges of the Buckhorn where the trails give out and the maps get honest about how little anybody knows. The study was a joint thing between the department and the university. Cougar and bobcat occupancy, which is a way of saying we were trying to find out where the cats were and were not, using the only method that works in country like that, which is to bolt 90 cameras to 90 trees on a grid and let them sit there for years and take pictures of whatever walks past. 90 cameras, 90 stations, each one a passive infrared unit in a steel housing with a padlock through the hasp aimed at a game trail or a bench or a saddle where animals move because animals are lazy, the same as people, and they take the easy line. The camera sits. Something warm walks in front of it. The sensor trips. It takes 3 frames a second apart, and then it waits. You do not get to choose what walks in front of it. That is the part nobody thinks about when they hear the job description. They picture cougars. They picture the poster shot, the cat mid-stride in the snow. And yes, we got those. And yes, they are worth the whole miserable business. But a camera on a game trail for a year takes pictures of everything. Elk, deer, bear, coyote, ravens landing on the housing and looking straight down the barrel with that flat, interested eye, squirrels. Rain, the wind moving a fern for 1100 frames on a March night because the sensor read the temperature difference wrong. Hunters, hikers, a woman in an orange rain shell squatting behind a log with her pants down because she did not know the camera was there and never will. We got about 300,000 frames a year on that grid. Somebody had to look at all of them. That somebody was mostly me, in a room in the back of a leased office in Sequim with a space heater and a window that looked out at a tire shop. 6 months in the field, 6 months at the monitor. I had a rolling chair with a bad wheel, and I had a wall calendar from a feed store, and I had a paper cup of pens. That was my whole professional life, and I liked it fine. I should tell you about the money, because the money is why I stayed longer than a smarter man would have. I was 39 that fall. I had a daughter named Callie who was 11 and lived with her mother in Bremerton, 2 ferries, and a bad hour of highway from anywhere I ever was. The custody agreement said every other weekend, and it said alternating holidays, and it said a lot of other things that assumed a father with a job that stopped at 5. The grid did not stop at 5. The grid ran a service rotation, which meant I was in the field 11 days out of 14 from May to November, and when I was in the field, I was out of cell range. And when I was out of cell range, I missed calls. And when I missed calls, it went in a file. Her mother had a lawyer. I had a wall calendar from a feed store. The contract ran through November, and there was talk of renewing it into a second phase. And if it renewed, I would have a year of steady pay. And if I had a year of steady pay, I could take an apartment in Bremerton and get a job at a hardware store and see my kid on Wednesdays. That was the plan. That was the whole architecture of my life that fall, built out of a study on cats that most people would tell you does not matter. So when the strap was on backward, I fixed the strap. I was not going to be the man who called Marcy Dunn on the satellite phone in October to tell her the strap was on backward. Marcy ran the project. She was maybe 50, out of Corvallis originally, and she had a way of listening to you on the radio where she would let 3 full seconds go by after you stopped talking so that you would fill the silence with the thing you had left out. She got a lot of information out of people that way. I liked her. I want to be clear about that because of what she did later and because I still do not know what I would have done in her place. The other thing about that fall is Denny Corliss. Denny had my job before I had it. He ran the grid for the previous 2 seasons and part of a third, and then in August he stopped showing up. That is how it was described to me. He stopped showing up. The department truck was in the lot at the slab camp trailhead with the keys under the mat, and there was a form filed, and there was a 2-week search that was mostly a formality, and there was nothing. Search and Rescue found a boot print they liked at Three Forks and lost it. They found a fleece glove on the Gray Wolf Trail that his sister said might have been his and might not. That was the sum total. He had not been on duty. It was his day off, and his own truck was gone, and everybody assumed he had driven it somewhere and walked in from there, and nobody ever established where, because the Eastern Olympics have about 40 places a man can leave a vehicle, and there's no earthly way to check them all. I never met him. I want to say that plainly. Everything I know about Denny Corliss I know from a green field notebook with a coffee ring on the cover that was in the door pocket of the department truck when they handed me the keys in May, and which I did not read until October, because it did not seem like mine to read, and because I have never been much of a reader, and because I think some part of me knew. The truck was a white Ford with 190,000 miles on it, and a topper that leaked at the front left corner. Under the seat there was a tire iron, a bag of jerky gone hard, and a pair of women's sunglasses that belonged to nobody I ever found. In the door pocket there was a map book, a can of bear spray with the safety clip missing, and the green notebook. I moved it every time I got a fresh map. 6 months of moving a dead man's notebook from one hand to the other and setting it back down. The night the strap was backward, I did the rest of the northeast run, which is stations 36 through 48, and I got back to the truck at 9 in the morning with 16 cards in a padded case and a blister on my right heel. I drove down the forest road, and I got a bar of signal at the bend above the Dungeness. And I pulled over and called Callie's school because it was a Thursday, and Thursday was when they did the lunch account. And I put $20 on it, and I sat in the truck with the engine off and listened to the rain. That was the last ordinary morning I had out there. I did not know it. Nobody ever does. But I have gone back to that morning more than any other, because I can still get inside it. The seat warm, the wipers off. The rain coming down on the hood in that pattern that is not a pattern. And a padded case on the passenger seat with 16 little cards in it, and on one of those cards 3 frames I had already taken and not seen yet. He was in them. He was already in them. I drove back to Sequim, and I ate a hamburger, and I slept for 10 hours, and the cards sat in the case on the kitchen counter of the bunkhouse the whole time, and whatever was in them waited for me, patient as a stone. Card review is the least dramatic work in the world, and the shape of it is the whole reason any of this happened. You put the card in a reader, the software makes a folder. The folder has anywhere from 200 to 4,000 images in it, depending on the station and the season and how much the wind blew. You open the first one and you press the right arrow key and you keep pressing the right arrow key. Most of it is nothing. A fern, the same fern 1,100 times. Then a deer's hind quarter leaving the frame. Then the fern again. You develop a rhythm, a kind of trance, and your eye learns to stop the trance when something breaks the shape of the frame. It is not thinking. It is lower than thinking. Your hand stops before you know why. For the animals, you tag, species, count, sex if you can call it, and a behavior code. There is a drop down. There are about 40 codes. For the people, there is a protocol. The protocol was written into the study agreement, and it was written by lawyers, and it read, in the part that mattered, that any image containing an identifiable human subject not affiliated with the project shall be deleted from the working archive and shall not be tagged, transmitted, or retained, and that the deletion shall be logged by frame number and station only. That is a privacy provision, and I want to say clearly that it is a reasonable one. You cannot bolt 90 cameras to public land and then keep a decade of photographs of the citizens who walk past them. The public would have your head, and they would be right. Every camera trap study in the country has some version of that rule. Ours had teeth. 2 techs had been fired over it before my time, one for showing a picture of a naked swimmer to his friends in a bar. So there was a keystroke. Control D. It moved the frame to a purge folder, it wrote a line in a text file with the station and the frame number and the timestamp and nothing else. And at the end of the review, the purge folder was overwritten with zeros by a script Marcy had written herself. I hit Control D about 1,000 times that summer. Hikers on the Grey Wolf Trail, a trail crew with a crosscut saw, a man on Station 22 with a rifle and a face I would know today. Kids, a woman crying, 2 men fighting, about a dog. Whole human lives, 3 frames at a time, gone before dinner. I never once looked at the log file. Nobody did. It was a compliance artifact. It existed so that if we were ever audited, we could show that we had deleted what we said we had deleted. It was, and I am being precise, a record of every human being the study had ever seen, kept in a form that contained no information about them at all, except that they had been there. 9 years of that. 600 and some odd pages of station numbers and frame numbers and timestamps. I am getting ahead. On the 15th of October, I sat down in the back room in Sequim with the space heater going, and I put in the card from Station 41. 2,940 frames. 2 weeks of them. Rain and fern and rain. A cow elk at dusk on the 2nd night, then again on the 4th, working the same bench. A bobcat at 4:12 a.m. on the 6th, beautiful, one of the good ones, the cat's whole body strung out in a step and the eyes gone silver in the infrared. Then, on the 9th night, at 2:17 in the morning, a man's boot. That is all it was. The bottom right corner of the frame, a boot and part of a calf in dark canvas, mid-step, motion blurred, going left to right about 6 feet from the lens. 2 frames. In the 3rd frame, he was out of it, and there was only the fern. I looked at it for a long time. Then I hit Control D, and the software asked me if I was sure, and I said I was sure, and the line went into the log. Here's what I want to say about that, and I have had a lot of time to work it out. I was not being lazy. I was following a rule that I believed in. A man was walking at night in a national forest, and that is legal, and that is his business, and taking his photograph without his knowledge and keeping it is not mine. But the boot bothered me in a way I could not put a hand on for 2 days. It bothered me in the shower. It bothered me while I was greasing the truck. Then on the Sunday I was in bed not sleeping, and I got it. There is no trail at Station 41. Not a maintained trail, not a boot trail, not anything a person walks. That station is 1.5 miles off the Grey Wolf and up through Slide Alder on a bench that I picked because a cat had scraped there and because you could not get to it without wanting to. It took me 40 minutes of misery to reach it every rotation. I had a route through the alder that I had beaten in myself since May, and even I lost it in the dark. He had come through at 2:17 in the morning at a walk. Not a stumble, a walk. Straight across the frame, the stride even, the boot flat, and the strap. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I sat at the kitchen table in the bunkhouse with the light off, which I noticed myself doing and did not stop. And I thought about the fact that I had deleted the only photograph in existence of a man who had been standing close enough to Station 41 to put his hands on it. In the morning I drove to the office, and I looked at the log file for the first time in my life. It is a text file. It is called purge_log.txt. It sorts by date. The columns are station, frame, timestamp, and technician initials. I searched it for Station 41. There were 206 entries. I want to be careful here, because I know what that number does when you hear it. It sounds like a haunting. It is not. 206 frames across 9 years is nothing. It is one deletion every 2.5 weeks, and a single person triggering a camera generates 3 frames, so call it 70 visits. 70 human visits to a spot in the woods over 9 years is about what you would expect from a station near a trail, except Station 41 is not near a trail. I sat back in the rolling chair with the bad wheel, and I looked at the tire shop across the parking lot, and I felt the room go a little bit further away from me. Then I sorted the whole file by timestamp instead of station, and I looked at the hours. Human beings in the woods walk in daylight. They walk between about 7 in the morning and about 6 in the evening, with a hard fall-off after dark, and the summer curve is fatter than the winter curve because of the light. That is not an opinion. It is the most reliable pattern in the entire discipline. Deer move at dawn and dusk. Cats move at night. People move when the sun is up, because we are diurnal animals with bad eyes, and we have been for the whole run of the species. Of the 11,400 human frames deleted from that grid in 9 years, a little over 3,500 were between midnight and 4 in the morning. I checked it 3 times. I built a chart in a spreadsheet because I did not trust my eye. It made a shape, 2 humps, one fat one in the middle of the day, the shape you would expect, hikers and hunters and trail crews and the occasional lost tourist, and another one, smaller, tighter, sitting between 1:30 and 3:30 in the morning like a second animal in the data that nobody had ever tagged because nobody had ever been allowed to look. I printed the chart. Then I took it off the printer and folded it into my jacket instead of leaving it on Marcy's desk, and I have never entirely understood why, except that I already knew it was going to sound like a man who had spent too many nights alone. That night I went back to the bunkhouse, and I got the green notebook out of the truck. It was a Write in the Rain, the green kind with the graph paper, the same book every field tech in the Northwest carries, because the pages do not turn to pulp when you drop them in a creek. The cover had a coffee ring on it and a crease down the middle from being carried in a back pocket. Somebody had written Corliss on the inside cover in ballpoint, and under that a phone number that was disconnected. The first 2/3 of it was the most boring document I have ever read, and I read every page. Station notes. Battery voltages. He wrote the voltage of every camera at every service, which is more than protocol asked, and which told me something about him before he ever told me anything himself. Bearings. Sketches of approach routes. A note that the padlock on Station 63 was rusted and to bring the spare. A phone number for a man named Ledbetter who would tow you out of the ditch on Forest Road 2800 for $60 if you called before 9 at night. There were personal things in there too. The way there are a grocery list. A line that said, "Call Mom Sunday," underlined twice. Somebody's birthday. A pressed piece of maidenhair fern between 2 pages that had gone the color of a paper bag. I was 2/3 through and half asleep when the handwriting changed. It did not change all at once. It got smaller. The letters got tighter and they got straighter, and the lines started running closer together, and he stopped skipping a line between entries. That is the first thing I noticed, and it took me a page to notice it, and once I did, I went back and found where it started. It started in the middle of a sentence about a battery. Station 63, 12.1 volts. Replaced, he is on the card again, that is 4. I read that line probably 50 times over the next 2 months. I want to lay out for you what Denny did next, because it is the strangest and the saddest thing in this whole business, and because I understand it, and because if you had put me in that chair a year earlier, I might have done it too. Denny Corliss was a scientist, not a credentialed one. He had an associate degree from Grays Harbor and a decade of fieldwork, and a way of thinking that had been shaped all the way down by a discipline that has exactly one method for dealing with a thing you do not understand. You do not run from it. You do not tell anybody about it. You describe it, you give it a designation, and you record its behavior, and you keep recording until the pattern comes out of the noise. Because the pattern always comes out of the noise if you are patient and honest and you do not put your thumb on it. So on the 12th of June, 2 seasons before I ever set foot on that grid, Denny Corliss opened a new page in the back of his field notebook and he wrote a heading. The heading said, Non-Target Anthropogenic Individual 1. And underneath it he wrote a species account. The same format we use for a cat. Adult male. Height estimated 5 feet 11 to 6 feet 1. Calculated against known housing dimensions in frame at Station 63. See Appendix. Build lean. Gait even. No observed limp. Stride length consistent across encounters, suggesting familiarity with substrate. Clothing dark, non-reflective. No visible logos or department issue. Head covering in all frames. Face not resolved in any frame to date. Then, further down, and a hand that had gotten smaller still. Individual 1 has been recorded on this grid on at least 14 occasions across 2 field seasons, all records nocturnal. No diurnal record exists. He does not use trails. He gave the man a study designation. He filed him under non-target species, which is where you put a raccoon that keeps setting off a camera meant for a lynx. He was going to describe him until he understood him. And then, because he was thorough and because he was a better technician than I will ever be, he did the one thing that nobody in 9 years had done. He stopped deleting. Not on the working archive. He was not a fool, and I do not think he ever considered breaking the protocol as such. What he did was worse, in every way that matters. He put a second card in his pocket. On his service rotation, he pulled the study card and he replaced it with a fresh card as always, and then he took the study card, and before he handed it in, he copied off it every human frame. 9 years he could not get, because those were gone, overwritten with zeros by a script. But going forward, from the 12th of June of that year, Denny Corliss had a private archive of every human being on the grid. He wrote the count in the margin as it grew. 61, 118, 402. Somewhere in the 400s it stopped being about a man. The entries from that August are what I would give a lot never to have read. Not because they are wild, because they are so exactly not wild. They read like every field note I have ever written in my life. 22nd August, Station 79, Individual 1, 1:12 a.m., frames 3314 through 3316, direction of travel east. Second subject in frame 3316, right edge partial, shorter, estimate 5 feet 4, designate Individual 2, pending resolution. 9th September, Station 79 and Station 80. Individual 1 recorded at both stations 41 minutes apart. Distance between stations 1.9 kilometers. Terrain severe. Direct line travel indicated he does not use trails and he does not use contours. He goes over 19th September. Individual 2 confirmed. Adult female probable. Individual 3. Juvenile. Height estimate under 4 feet. Recorded Station 80. 2:40 a.m. In company with Individual 2. Frames retained. 27th September. Reviewed retained frames sequentially by station rather than by date. Am an idiot. Am a complete idiot. That was the whole entry. Then a gap of 4 days. The 1st of October. Sorted by station and date, the pattern is not subtle, and I have been staring at it for 2 seasons without seeing it, because I look at cards one at a time in the order they come out of the case. They are not moving through the grid at random, they are moving through it in the same order that I service it. I put the notebook down on the kitchen table and I got up and I went and stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse and looked out at the parking lot for a while. The service rotation is a document. It lived in a binder in the office, and it lived on a laminated card in the door of the truck, and it lived in my head. Northeast Run, stations 36 through 48, Tuesday and Wednesday. Ridge Run, 49 through 62, Thursday. 63 through 74, Friday. The Far Run, 75 through 90, 3 days. Sunday through Tuesday, and then a day off, and then back around. It ran on a 14-day cycle, because a 14-day cycle matched the battery life in the cold. It had run on a 14-day cycle since the grid was built. Anybody who watched a man do a thing every 14 days for 9 years would know the rotation. I went back inside and I read the rest of it. The rest of it is 31 pages long, and it took me until 2 in the morning. Some of it is not mine to repeat. There is a page in there about his mother that I skipped after the first line and skipped again every time after. Here is the substance. Denny worked out that individual one appeared overwhelmingly on cameras Denny had serviced within the previous 48 hours. Not on cameras he was about to service. On cameras he had just left. The man was following him through the grid, one day behind, walking the same stations in the same order. Denny's first theory was theft, which is the sane theory. There are meth camps, and there are grows, and there are men who do not want a photograph taken of them going where they are going. And a man like that would want to know where the cameras were and would want to know when the cards came out. But nothing was ever stolen. Not one camera in 9 years. Not one card. Not one battery. And no camera was ever destroyed, and no camera was ever turned to face the sky, which is what a man does when he does not want to be seen and has no time. Denny had reports going back to the grid's construction. 2 housings damaged by bears, 1 lost to a falling limb. That was all. Denny's second theory took him a long time to write down, and when he wrote it down, he wrote it in a hand so cramped I had to hold the page under the lamp. He wrote, "He is not avoiding the cameras. In 2 seasons and 400 and some frames, he has never once been photographed accidentally. He is always in the center of the frame, or he is deliberately at the edge. He is never crouched, he is never startled, he is never blurred except when he chooses. He knows exactly where the beam is because he has stood in front of it and watched it fire." And then, at the bottom of the page, on its own line, he is not being photographed, he is posing. I called Marcy on the Monday. I did not lead with the notebook. I have gone back and forth on whether that was cowardice, and I have decided that it was, and that it was also the only move available to a man who wanted to keep his contract. I led with the log file. I told her I had been looking at deletion timestamps, and that there was a nocturnal cluster, and that it looked odd to me, and I asked whether anybody had ever run the numbers on it. She let the 3 seconds go by. I had known her since March, and I still filled it. I said it might be nothing. She said, and I have it close to exact, that the log file is a compliance artifact and is not studied data, that human presence is not a variable in the model, and that if I had spare hours in the review week, she could find me something better to do with them. Then she said, and this is the part, she said, "Is this about Denny?" I said no. She said, "Boyd, we are going to have this conversation once. He was a good tech, and he got fixated, and the fixation ate him, and then he walked into that country in August with a day pack, and he did not come out." She said, "I sat in a room with his sister. I am not doing that again." I said I understood. She said, "There are people out there. It is a national forest. There have always been people out there. I have thought about that sentence for a while. Everything that is wrong with what happened is in it, and nothing in it is a lie." I said, "All right." She said, "When you go back out, take the satellite phone and check in at 8 and 8. Then she said one more thing, after a pause that was not one of her 3-second pauses, but something rougher, and I do not think she meant to say it, and I think it was the truest thing she ever said to me. She said, "Do not read his notebook." Then she hung up, and I sat there in my truck outside a coffee stand in Sequim with the phone in my lap, and I understood that Marcy Dunn had read it. I went back out on the Tuesday. I want to describe the country now, because until this point in the telling it has just been a word, and it deserves better. The gray wolf comes down off the eastern spine of the Olympics in a valley that is steeper than it has any right to be, and the river is the color of a nickel, and it runs loud enough that a man standing 8 feet from you has to say a thing twice. The forest on the lower valley is second growth, and it is dark and it is dull. Higher up, in the pockets the cutters never got to because the ground was too broken to build a road on, it turns into something that no photograph has ever once been true about. Doug fir and silver fir, 8 and 9 feet through the butt. Devil's club in every wet seam, and the wet seams are everywhere. Slide alder in the old avalanche pass, which grows uphill in a curve like a bent finger, in which you do not walk through, you swim through, and it takes you an hour to make 400 yards, and you come out the other side bleeding from the wrists. There is no such thing as a straight line in that country. Everything that lives there knows it. The elk know the benches. The cats know the ridges. The people who ever built anything in there built it at the confluences where two hard things met and made an easy one. And in 900 square miles of it, there are maybe 50 miles of maintained trail. That is the whole thing. That is the entire secret of the place, and it is printed on every map that has ever been made of it, and nobody looks at it and sees anything. You could put a house in there. You could put 4 houses in there, and a garden, and a spring box, and a woodshed, and you would never be found. Not because the country is impassable, but because it is uninteresting. Nobody goes anywhere in the Olympics that is not on the way to something. The trails go to the lakes and the passes and the peaks. Everything in between is a hole in the map with contour lines drawn over it, and the contour lines are the only thing anybody has ever thought about it. The camera grid did not care about any of that. That is what nobody understood, including me, longer than I should have. A camera grid is not built to go anywhere. It is built to sample. You take the study area and you overlay a grid, and you put a camera in every cell, whether or not there is a trail, whether or not there is a reason, whether or not a human being has ever put a foot there in the history of the world. For 9 years. Ours was the only thing in the Eastern Olympics that had been looking at the holes. I ran the Northeast Run on the Tuesday and the Ridge Run on the Thursday, and I did it with a notebook in my jacket pocket, which was heavy and which I could feel every time I sat down. At Station 63 on the Friday, I found the lens. Station 63 sits on a bench above the Cameron Creek Fork on a big fir with the bark plated up like armor. It is one of the older stations. It has a padlock that rusts, which Denny wrote about, and the housing has a scar on the lid where a bear worked at it in the first season. The lens was clean. It takes doing the job for a while to feel what I felt. In that forest, in October, a camera lens gets a film on it in about 9 days. It is not dirt. It is a haze, mist, and pollen, and the fine grit that comes off a fir in the rain, and it goes on so slow you never see it happen, and it is the reason your night frames go milky in the fall. Every technician on every grid in the wet part of this country carries a lens cloth and starts every service by wiping the glass. It is the first thing your hand does when the housing opens, before the card, before the batteries. The glass at Station 63 was clear, not wiped that morning clear, but clean, the way glass is clean 4 or 5 days after you have wiped it, and nobody has touched it since. I had last serviced that camera 19 days before. I stood on the bench with my hand on the housing, and I did not open it for what felt like a long while, and I remember the sound of Cameron Creek down through the trees, and I remember thinking about the strap at Station 41, and I remember one clear thought coming up through me like a bubble in a tar pit. He is maintaining them. Whoever he is, he wants the pictures to come out. I opened the housing and I pulled the card and I put in a fresh one and I wiped the glass I did not need to wipe, and I cinched the strap, and I want to tell you that I checked which way the tail came out, and I did check, and it came out on the left the way I like it, and that did not make me feel any better at all. I did not sleep in the truck that night. I drove out to Sequim in the dark on Forest Road 2800 with the high beams on and my hands at 10 and 2, and I stopped once had a switchback where the trees open on a view down the valley, because I saw a light, one light, white, down the black of the drainage where there is nothing, no road, no trail, no reason. It was maybe 2 miles out. It moved a little, and then it stopped, and then it went out. I sat there with the truck idling for 4 or 5 minutes, and it did not come back on. Then I drove home. I put the card in the reader at 11 at night in the back room with the space heater ticking, and I opened the folder and I pressed the right arrow key. 2,400 frames. Rain. Fern. A pair of blacktail. A coyote that had been coming through that bench all year. An old one with a bad ear that I had tagged 9 times and had started to think of as somebody I knew. At frame 986, the man was standing in front of the camera. He was 3 feet from the lens, centered. The infrared flash washed him white and flattened him the way it does, so that he came out of the dark like something printed rather than something photographed. Dark canvas coat, gloves, a knit cap pulled low, and below it nothing, because he had his head tipped down at an angle so exact that the brim of the shadow crossed his face at the bridge of the nose. It was not chance. You cannot do that by chance in a frame you cannot see the result of. In his right hand, held up at chest height where the camera would see it, was a soft cloth. 2:17 in the morning. The next frame, 1 second later, was the same. The third frame, 1 second after that, was the same, except that his head had come up perhaps 1/4 of an inch, and the shadow line had moved down off the bridge of his nose, and there was a chip of light in the socket of his right eye where the infrared caught the wet of it. And then the fourth frame was the fern. I did not hit Control D. I sat in the rolling chair with the bad wheel in an empty office at 11:15 at night, and I did not hit Control D, and that is the exact minute I stopped being an employee of that study and became something else. I did not decide it. It happened. My hand was on the key and my hand did not move, and the room got very quiet and the space heater ticked. Then I took the card out of the reader and I put it in my shirt pocket, and I drove back to the bunkhouse and I put it in a coffee can under the sink. 2:17 in the morning at Station 63. 2:17 in the morning at Station 41. Different nights. 12 days apart. 9 miles of the worst country in the state between them. Same minute. Here is the thing about a camera trap photograph that I had known for 9 years, the way you know the color of your own front door. The timestamp is burned into the frame. Bottom right corner, white characters on a black bar, month and day and year and the hour and the minute and the temperature and the moon phase. It is not metadata. It is not a file property. It is printed on the image itself by the camera at the moment of exposure, and you cannot remove it, and every camera trap ever built does it, because a photograph of an animal without a time on it is worth nothing. And the second thing, when we deleted a human being from the working archive, we kept the station and the frame number and the timestamp. That was the whole compliance provision. We logged what we destroyed. We could not log the man, because logging the man was the thing we were forbidden to do. We could log the minute. I sat in the back room in Sequim on the Saturday morning with a cold cup of coffee and the purge log open, and I sorted 11,400 rows by the minute column. 2:17, 91 entries at 2:17 in the morning out of 11,400. If the minutes were random, you would expect about 8. 2:19 had 84. 2:21 had 90. 2:23, 87. Odd minutes. Only odd minutes. In a band from about 151 to about 311, and inside that band the counts were flat, and outside it they were 0. I put my head down on the desk. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. I put my forehead on the cool laminate next to the keyboard, and I stayed there while the space heater ticked, and somebody's air wrench went off across the parking lot at the tire shop. For 9 years, the only record our study kept of the people in that forest was a number, and somebody had gotten hold of the number. He could not leave a note, because a note gets found and picked up and thrown away, and because a note is a thing a stranger wrote. He could not stand in front of the camera and be seen, because we deleted him. We had been deleting him with real diligence since before the trees around Station 41 had grown enough to need the strap adjusted. But we kept them in it. We were required by law to keep them in it. So he chose it. That is all he ever did. He did not spell anything. There was no code in it. Denny had run it against every cipher a man with an associate degree from Grays Harbor could find on a library computer, and it came up nothing. And Denny wrote at the bottom of that page, in the smallest hand in the entire notebook, "There is no message. The message is that there could be one." He has spent 9 years demonstrating that he can put any number he chooses into a federal record and that we will file it and never read it. That is not communication. That is a survey. He is finding out what we look at. And then 3 lines down, and this is the last thing Denny Corliss ever wrote in that book that was about the study. "We have been sampling that country for 9 years. So has he. He has better data." The appendix was in the back on the last 11 pages upside down, which is a thing field techs do when they want a second document in the same book. It was station accounts, all 90 in service order, with his own private counts for each, how many times individual one had been recorded there, what the terrain was, what time of night, where the deleted frames clustered, and on the second to last page, hand-drawn in pencil with a scale bar and a north arrow, there was a map. It showed the upper Cameron Basin and a piece of country south of it that had no trail on it and no name on it that I ever found on anything printed. It showed the location of stations 85 through 90, which are the far run, the 3-day run, the ones you get to by walking in from the Deer Park Road and sleeping on the ground. And it showed one more. A small square, penciled in, on a bench above an unnamed fork, about 2.5 miles beyond Station 90. He had written a number next to it, 91. There is no Station 91. The grid has 90 cells. It has had 90 cells since it was surveyed. 90 is written into the study design and the funding and the model, and there is not a document anywhere in that project that says a number higher than 90. Denny had bought a camera. He wrote about it in a way that told me he had thought about it for a good while. It was his own money and his own housing and his own lock, and he had carried it in on the far run in July and bolted it to a fur and told nobody. It was not on the grid. It would never be serviced. It would never be reviewed. It would never be deleted, because the protocol did not know it existed, and the protocol was a document about 90 cameras. Under the map, he wrote, "It faces downhill and south. Set to 5-frame burst, no video, 1-second interval. Battery's good for 11 months in the cold. If I am wrong, there will be nothing on it." Under that, in ink, later, and I could tell it was later because the pen was different, "I am not wrong. I am going to go and look." And under that, nothing. 12 blank pages, and then the back cover. The far run started on the Sunday. I have replayed the Saturday night a lot. What I could have done, I could have driven to Marcy's house on First Street with the notebook and put it on her kitchen table and sat there while she read it. I could have called the sheriff and said that a man had disappeared in August, and I had reason to believe there were people living unrecorded in the Buckhorn, and that they had been photographing my predecessor's routine for 2 years. I did neither. I want to tell you why, and the reason is so small and so human that I am almost embarrassed by it. If I called anybody, they would take the grid. Not from me, from everybody. There would be an incident and a review and a suspension of field operations, and the study would stop, and the contract would not renew, and there would be no apartment in Bremerton, and no hardware store job, and no Wednesdays. And under that, further down, where I did not look at it directly for a while, I wanted to see, "That is the honest thing." Denny wrote, "I am going to go and look," and I read those words in a bunkhouse kitchen at 1 a.m, and something in my chest sat up like a dog hearing a car in the drive. I packed for the far run the way I always did, 3 days of food and a 4th in reserve. Bivy sack, stove, 40 batteries, 40 cards, the satellite phone that Marcy told me to carry, and the check-in times, 8 and 8. I also packed the notebook and a handsaw and my father's buck knife, which I had not carried into the field one single time in 9 years. That is the part. I did not admit to myself that I was afraid. I just put a knife in the bag. I drove up the Deer Park Road on the Sunday morning in the dark. It is 17 miles of gravel with a 2,000-foot drop off the right side and no guardrail, and you meet nobody on it in October. And the fog sat in the switchback so thick that twice I stopped the truck and got out and walked in front of it to find the edge. I parked at the end, where the road gives out. There was one other vehicle in the pullout. An old brown Chevy with a canopy, backed in, plates dirty. There was a fine skin of moss on the driver's side mirror. I looked at that moss for a while. A vehicle grows moss on a mirror in a wet fall in about 6 weeks. I wrote the plate down in my notebook, and then I looked at what I had written, and I saw that I had written it as a series of letters and figures, the way a man writes a thing he intends to give to somebody, and I understood that some part of me had already decided that I was going to be giving somebody a report about all of this, and that the report would be the kind where you list what you saw before it happened. I shouldered the pack, and I started up the trail towards Station 85, with the sun not up and the fog and the subalpine fir lying so still that walking through it felt like a rudeness. Station 85 is on the ridge, in the Krumholtz, and it is the easiest of the far run and the only one with a view. I serviced it at 9 in the morning with my hands aching from the cold. Elk on the card. 200 frames of a bull walking back and forth in front of the lens for 11 minutes in September, the way they do when the rut has taken their sense away, nothing else. 86 is down off the ridge in the trees, and it is a bad walk. 50 minutes, nothing on the card but rain. 87 is on the flat above the creek where I bivvy on the first night of the far run, and have every rotation since May, in the same spot, under the same overhanging fir, because it is the only flat dry ground within a mile. The camera at 87 was pointed at my bivvy spot. I saw it from 30 yards out. You know the aim of a camera you have serviced 11 times the way you know how far to turn your own kitchen faucet. That housing had faced northeast at a game trail crossing since the day it went up. It was facing southwest. I want to describe exactly what I did, because it took me a long time to forgive myself for it. I walked up to it. I checked the bolt, which was tight. I checked the strap, which was cinched with the tail coming out the right. I opened the housing and I looked at the card, and the card was mine, the one I had put in 19 days before, with my initials and the date on the label in silver marker. And the camera had a little screen on the back of it, the size of 2 postage stamps, because every camera trap made in the last 15 years has a little screen on the back of it, so a technician can check his aim without walking back to the truck. I pressed play. 4,100 frames. I thumbed the button and watched it go by, a frame a second, on a screen the size of 2 postage stamps, standing in the rain in a forest where nobody had been for 19 days. Rain, rain. The bivvy spot empty, the fir, the flat ground, rain. Then, on the night of the 6th day after I had left, at 2:23 in the morning, a man came down the slope from the northeast, out of the game trail crossing where the camera used to be pointed. He walked to the flat ground under the fir. He stopped in the exact place where I put my head, and he stood there a while, and the burst ran out, and the camera slept, and something moved, and the burst started again, and he was still there. 51 minutes he stood there. I counted it off the timestamps. Then he crouched. He put one hand flat on the ground where I sleep, not feeling for anything, just putting his hand there, the way you put your hand on the hood of a truck to see if it is warm. And then he got up and he walked toward the camera, toward the lens, and in the last frames he was reaching up out of the top of the picture where the bolt was, and then the frames stopped. The next frames were the same forest at the same hour with the aim turned back the other way, northeast, at the game trail. Then, 112 frames later, on the same night, the aim was southwest again, at my bivvy spot, and it stayed there for the remaining 13 days. He had turned it to look at where I sleep, then he had turned it back to look at where the animals go, and then he had thought about it, and then he had turned it around again and left it that way, so that when I came back I would open the housing and press the little button and see. I stood in the rain with a camera in my hands and my thumb on a plastic button, and I said something out loud, and I do not remember what it was. Here is what I did with the rest of that day. I did not go back down the trail. I could have. It was 10 in the morning, and I could have been at the truck by dark and out on the Deer Park Road by 9 and in Sequim by 11 with the notebook and the card and every reason a man has ever had. I unbolted the camera at Station 87, and I turned it northeast at the game trail, and I torqued the bolt down, and I cinched the strap so the tail came out on the left, and I put a fresh card in it, and I picked up my pack, and I walked on to Station 88. I have thought about why. The best I have is this. Turning that camera back was the last piece of work I ever did as a wildlife technician on a cougar and bobcat occupancy study, and I wanted it done right, and after that there was not going to be any work anymore, only the other thing. I did 88 and 89 that afternoon, both clean, both cards full of rain, and one lovely long sequence of a cat on 89, a big tom, thick through the neck, walking the bench at 11 at night with his tail carried in that low relaxed hook, and I stood in the trees and looked at that cat on a screen the size of 2 postage stamps, and felt something in my chest come loose, because he was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and because he was going through that country the way I never would, which is to say, he was not afraid of any part of it. I did not sleep under the fir at 87 that night. I went 2 miles past it, and I slept sitting up against a log with the knife open in my lap, and I did not sleep. And the fog came in, and the night was so quiet I could hear the blood in my own ears. Station 90 is the last one. It sits on a nose of ground above the confluence of 2 forks of a creek that the map does not name, at 4,100 feet, and to get to it from 89 you drop 900 feet through Slide Alder and climb it back on the other side. I serviced it at 10 in the morning. The card had a bear on it and rain, and at 2:19 on the night of the 5th day, the man walking left to right at the very edge of the frame, so that only his back half was in it. He was carrying something over his shoulder. I could not tell what. Long, wrapped, and the wrapping was pale. I took Denny's map out of my jacket, and I sat down on my pack in the rain, and I looked at the little penciled square with 91 written next to it, 2.5 miles south, on a bench above a fork that had no name. There is no honest way to make what I did next sound like courage. I was 39 years old, and I had a daughter I saw twice a month, and I had $1,100 in a checking account. And I had spent 9 years looking at photographs of a country I'd never once walked into for any reason that was not a paycheck. And Danny Corliss had written, "I am not wrong." And then he had written, "I am going to go and look." And then he had gone. And then a green notebook with his mother's phone number in it had sat in the door pocket of a truck for 14 months, while men who never met him drove it up and down a gravel road. I put the map back in my jacket and I went south. It took me 5 hours to make 2.5 miles. Alder, and then a talus fan I had to cross 1 rock at a time, and then a stand of old fir so dark at midday that the ground under it was bare needles and nothing green at all. That is the thing about that country. It fights you, and then all at once it lets you go, and you come out onto a floor like the inside of a church, and you can walk for a mile without touching a branch. I came out on the bench at 4 in the afternoon with maybe an hour of usable light, and I found Denny's camera in 11 minutes, because he had drawn me a map, and because he had bolted it 4 feet up a fir with a blaze of cambium showing where he had scraped the bark to seat the housing flat. It was running. The little green pinprick of the ready light was showing through the vent slot in the housing, which meant the batteries were still up 15 months on. It faced downhill and south, exactly as he wrote. I stood behind it, and I looked where it was looking. The bench fell away into a bowl maybe 400 feet deep and half a mile across, and the bottom of the bowl was flat, and the creek ran through it in a slow set of bends because it had nowhere to hurry to. And along the north side of the flat, back against the the timber where the winter sun would find them and the wind would not, there were 3 buildings, not cabins. I have seen 100 old cabins in that forest, prospectors and trappers and the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they are all the same. They are a box with a collapsed roof and a stovepipe in the salmonberry, and they have been dead for 80 years. These had roofs, split cedar shake, mossed but sound, and the moss was cut back around the pipes. There was a wire strung between 2 trees with something on it. There was ground turned over in a rectangle, maybe 40 feet by 20, and it had been turned recently, and there were stakes in it with string. And from the pipe of the middle building there was smoke, not a plume. You would never have seen it from a plane, and there is no plane that flies low over that country in October anyhow. It was a thin gray thread that came up about 15 feet, and then leaned east and came apart, the smoke of a fire built by somebody who knows exactly how much wood to put on and what kind, and has known it for so long that they do not think about it the way I do not think about which way I run a strap. I got down on my knees behind Denny's camera. It was not a decision. My legs did it. There is a thing that happens when your brain finally accepts a piece of information it has been refusing, and what happens is that the world goes very sharp and very small. I could hear my own coat. I could hear the creek 400 feet below, a low, steady sound, like a truck idling in the next county. I could smell the fir needles, and under that I could smell wood smoke, and I had been smelling it for 20 minutes and had not let myself. I reached up and I opened the housing. The little screen came on. 14,206 frames. I pressed play and I held the button down and I watched 15 months of a place go past on a screen the size of 2 postage stamps, a frame a second, in the last of an October afternoon. It started in July, because that is when Denny bolted it up there, and the first frames on it are of a summer, the bowl green, the garden already up and staked, a line strung between 2 trees with wash on it, moving a little the same wash for 4 days, because it does not dry fast down in a hole like that. 6 people. I counted them over and over. 6. 3 adults and 2 children, and one who was very old, who came out onto a bench in front of the middle building in the good weather and sat, and whose face I never once saw, because it was 400 feet, and a bad lens, and the failing light of a screen the size of 2 postage stamps. They were not hiding. That is the whole of it. In their own bowl, in the bottom of a hole, in a map, in the 400 feet between the timber and the creek. They were not hiding from anything. They hung wash on a line. They stood and talked with their hands. The tall one sat down on a stump one evening and took his boot off and looked at his foot a long while with his elbow on his knee, the way any man does. And I watched him do it 15 months later on a 2-inch screen. And my throat closed up. The children ran the way children run, which is badly, all elbows. And every night one of them left, almost every night, a figure coming up out of the bowl and passing the camera on the bench, going north, into the grid. They had been sampling that country for a long time. Denny wrote it, and it was true. I thumbed the button faster. The frames went by under my thumb. And then it was the 22nd of August, and it was 2 in the afternoon, and a man came into the frame from behind the camera. I knew it was him before there was anything to know it by. He was in the top of the picture, small, from behind, walking away downhill. Denny Corliss had a day pack on. He had a green field jacket. He had his hands loose at his sides. He was not creeping and he was not hurrying. He walked down off the bench into the bowl toward the buildings at a steady pace, with his head up, and about halfway down he stopped, and he turned around and he looked back up at his own camera. He was too far away for a face. The infrared was off because it was daylight, and so it was a color frame, and he was a small green man on a green hill, and he stood there and looked up at the lens for 3 frames, which is 3 seconds. Then he turned back around and walked down into the bowl toward the buildings and out of the bottom of the picture. And the camera kept taking photographs of that bowl for 15 months. I sat there on my heels in the dark, because it was dark by then, and I thumbed through the rest of it, and there is no more of Denny Corliss in it. He does not come back up the hill. Nothing runs. Nothing chases. Nobody comes out of the buildings and stands and points. The wash goes on the line the next morning. On the 11th of September, 20 days after, at 3 in the afternoon, a man came up the hill from the bowl and walked to the camera and stood in front of it at arm's length. Dark canvas, gloves, knit cap, his head tipped down at the angle that put the shadow across his face at the bridge of the nose. He lifted his right hand. He had a soft cloth in it. He reached past the lens, where the camera could not follow him, and I could see the sleeve of his coat, and then he came back into frame, and he looked at the glass, and he was satisfied with it. Then the seasons went by under my thumb. Snow. The bowl white and the buildings with their roofs loaded and the smoke threads standing straight up in the cold. A woman in the snow with a bucket, small in the frame, walking from the middle building to the creek and back. The same walk. Over and over, all through the white months, 100 times, 200, the bucket going down empty and coming back heavy and her body leaning against the weight of it. Then the thaw, and the garden turned over again with a shovel and a spading fork. One of the children fell down in the mud in April and sat there, and the other one came back for him. Then another summer, and the wash on the line, and the old one on his bench in the sun, and one of them leaving every night and going north into the grid, and no Greenfield jacket anywhere in any frame. Not once, in more than a year of them. For 15 months, on a bench above an unnamed fork, in a place that appeared on no document owned by any agency of any government, somebody had been keeping a dead man's camera clean. That was when I understood the whole thing, and it took about a second and a half. They knew the protocol, not the word, the behavior. For 9 years they had walked in front of 90 cameras and watched a man in a truck come and take a cart away every 14 days, and nothing ever happened. No helicopter, no sheriff, no fence, nothing. They had run the experiment for 9 years with a sample size of 11,400, and the finding was clean and it was repeatable, and any scientist would sign it. The pictures did not matter. The pictures went into a hole, so they had done the only thing that was left. They had stopped trying to be seen by the study. They had gone to work on the one man who actually looked at the frames, one card at a time, alone, at a desk. They kept his lenses clean. They walked into his center of frame at a minute he would remember. They turned his camera around to look at where he slept, and then they turned it back, and then they thought better of it and turned it around again because they wanted him to be sure. And they were not stalking Denny Corliss. They were trying to talk to him. He was the only ear in 900 square miles. And he heard them. He heard them so clearly that he bought a camera with his own money and put it where it would see them living. And then, in August, he walked down that hill in daylight with his hands loose at his sides and his head up. And he stopped halfway and turned around and looked at the lens. He was checking his aim. He was making sure the record was running. Behind me, up the slope, at the height of a man's chest, a small red point of light came on. I did not turn around. I want to be exact about this because it is the only thing I did right in that whole autumn. I did not turn around, and I did not stand up, and I did not run. I knew what it was. Every camera trap fires a low red pre-flash before the infrared burst, and it lasts a quarter of a second, and it is the reason a bobcat will sometimes look right down the barrel in frame 2. It means a camera you did not know was there has just decided you are warm. There was no camera up that slope. I had put none there. Denny had drawn none there. It stayed on longer than a quarter of a second. It stayed on for what I counted later, sitting in my truck, as somewhere between 4 and 6 seconds, which is not a pre-flash, which is a man holding down a button on the back of a housing so that the light will stay lit. Then it went out. I closed Denny's housing. My hands did it. I got the little latch closed, and the two of them do that job on their own after 9 years, and then I stood up with my back to that slope and I looked down at the bowl one more time. There was a light in the window of the middle building. Not a lamp, a stove door, open, orange, and somebody moving in front of it. I walked north off that bench I did not go back the way I came over the talus, because the talus takes daylight. I went north along the contour, into the dark timber where the floor is bare needles, and I walked for 4 hours with my headlamp off and my hands out in front of me. And I hit the creek at the bottom of the drop below Station 90, and I went up the other side on my hands and knees. Nothing followed me. Nothing has ever followed me. I want to be very clear about that, because that is not the part that wakes me up. The part that wakes me up is that when I came out into the pullout at the end of the Deer Park Road at 4 in the morning, the brown Chevy with the mossed mirror was still sitting there, and it had not been touched, and it had not been driven, and its plates were still dirty, and I stood next to my truck and I understood that it had been sitting in that pullout since the middle of August, and that it was Denny's, and that it had never been his sister who came and got it, and that whoever wrote the report about his truck being in the lot at Slab Camp for 4 days had been writing about a different lot on a different road on a different piece of ground entirely, and that not one single person in the state of Washington had ever driven up here to look. I drove down that road with the fog in the switchbacks, and I did not stop for it. I was in Sequim at 7 in the morning. I did not go to the bunkhouse. I drove to First Street, and I sat in Marcy Dunn's driveway until the kitchen light came on, and then I knocked on her door with the notebook in my hand. She made coffee. She let me get all the way to the end of it. She did not fill the silences, and she did not do the 3-second thing, and when I was done, she sat with both hands around her cup and looked at the middle of the table. She said, 6? I said, 6. She said, how old was the oldest one? I said I did not know, and that I could not see faces at that distance, and that he sat outside in the sun. She got up, and she stood at the sink, with her back to me for a while, and then she said something I have never repeated to anybody, and I am not going to now. And then she said, I am going to make some calls today, and you are going to go home, and you are not going to talk to anybody. She said, Ann Boyd, whatever you have on that card in the coffee can under your sink, do not put it on a computer. I never told her about the coffee can. The study was terminated in March. The letter said the funding cycle had not been renewed, and it thanked us for our contributions to the understanding of carnivore occupancy in the Eastern Olympics. A contractor pulled the 90 cameras off the trees in April and May, working from a spreadsheet, 2 men in a side-by-side, and I know from a man who knows one of them that they did the whole grid in 11 days and never went past Station 90, because Station 90 was the last row of the spreadsheet. Nobody has ever asked me a single question about Denny Corliss. I want to be careful and say the true thing here, which is that I do not know that Marcy did nothing. She may have made every call she said she would. There may be a file somewhere with a map in it and a photograph of a bench above an unnamed fork, and somewhere in an office in Olympia or in Portland, a person may have read it and thought about the 6 of them, and thought about jurisdiction, and about what it would cost, and about what it would mean if it turned out that people had been living quietly in a hole in the Buckhorn for longer than the study had been looking at them, and had done nothing to anyone who did not walk down the hill toward them with his hands loose at his sides. I do not know. I know that in April a contractor took down 90 cameras, and that Denny's brown Chevy was gone from the Deer Park pullout by then, and that there is nothing in that country now, not one lens, and that whatever the 6 of them do at 2:17 in the morning, they do it without anybody keeping the minute. The purge log went where records go. There is a retention schedule, 611 pages of station numbers and frame numbers and timestamps on a server, in a building, in a city. And every 14 days for about a year afterward, I would catch myself thinking, tonight is the far run, and then remembering there is no far run and no cameras and nothing to write a number into. I got the apartment in Bremerton. That part came true, which I did not expect and which I have never entirely known what to do with. I work at a lumber yard now on Kitsap Way, and I am good at it because I can look at a stack of 2x8s and tell you which one is crowned, and I do not have to think about how I know. Callie comes Wednesdays and every other weekend. She is 14. She thinks the woods are boring, and she is not wrong to think so. Marcy died in a car on Highway 101 in the spring after that, in the rain, near Blinn, and it was the ordinary kind of thing that happens on that road 9 times a year, and I went to the service and stood in the back. Nobody ever found the cards Denny copied. Not in the bunkhouse, not in his sister's garage, not in the brown Chevy when they finally towed it. 2 years of a private archive of every human being on that grid, and it is somewhere or it is not. I still have the card in the coffee can. I have never put it in a reader. It is not because I am afraid of what is on it, because I know exactly what is on it. I saw it on a monitor at 11:15 at night in an empty office. It is because that photograph is the only one of him that survives anywhere in the world, and I am the last man who is required to keep it. And I have decided that I am going to keep it the way we should have kept the others, which is to say by not looking. Last thing, 2 years ago I bolted a camera to the fence post at the back of my yard in Bremerton. It looks across the grass at the back door. It cost me $200, and I put it in a steel housing with a padlock through the hasp, which is more than a man needs in a yard with a fence. I pull the card every Sunday morning. I have a rhythm to it. I come out the back door at 7 with my coffee, and I go across the wet grass in my socks, which is a thing I would have called stupid at any other point in my life. And I open the housing and I wipe the glass with a soft cloth before I do anything else. Card out, card in. Batteries checked, voltage written down in a green notebook I keep in the kitchen drawer. Then I close it and I cinch the strap so the tail comes out on the left, and I go back inside. The card is always empty. 900 frames of Callie's dog in the wind, in the arborvitae, and 1 raccoon. I keep doing it anyway, every Sunday at 7, in the same order, in my socks, because a thing that is watched behaves better, and because if anybody out there has ever put a soft cloth to a lens I own, I would like them to have gotten a good, clear look at a man who does the same thing at the same hour every week of his life. Predictable, uninteresting, nothing in the frame worth a second one. I cinch the strap, and I go inside, and I close the door, and I stand there in the kitchen for a minute with my hand on it, the way you stand when the coffee is still hot and there is nowhere you have to be, and then I go and I pour it out and start over. The pager went off at 2:11 in the morning, and I was awake before the second tone because I sleep the way a man sleeps when he has been on a call-out list for 19 years, which is not really sleeping at all. Dana did not move. She has trained herself the other way. She lay there with her back to me and her breathing steady while I found my pants on the chair and my boots by the door, and neither of us said anything, and that is not coldness. That is just what 19 years does to the middle of the night. When I came back at noon or at 4 or on Sunday, she would ask how it went, and I would say we got her, or I would say we did not, and she would nod and get up and put a plate in front of me. The tone that night was a call-out for a missing hiker on the Snake Den Ridge Trail, female, 43, last seen Sunday afternoon, overdue since Sunday evening. Cock County Unit, Park cooperating. I run a well and septic outfit in Cosby, Tennessee, out of a shop with my name on it, which is Gantry, and I have run it since my father died and left me the truck and the debt. 6 days a week I pull pumps and cut trench and argue with people about their leach fields. The 7th day is whatever the pager wants. I have been the team leader on the county side for 11 years. That is not a compliment. It means I am the one who is willing to do the paperwork. I got to the staging area at 3:40. They had it set up in the gravel lot at the campground, which is closed in October, and the light stands were up, and somebody had made coffee in a Cambro. There were maybe 18 of us by 4. County team, park team, 2 deputies, a dog handler down from Newport with a shepherd that would not stop crying in the crate. And Chet Caro was already there. Chet was always already there. That was the first thing about him that anybody noticed, and it was the last thing anybody thought about, because being early is not a sin, it is the opposite. And in 19 years, I have never once heard a search manager complain about a man who shows up before the coffee is made. He was standing at the edge of the light with a cup in his hand, not talking to anybody. He was 61 then. Lean the way a certain kind of mountain man is lean, all rope and knuckle, with a face that had been out in the weather so long it did not really have an expression on it anymore, just the leftover shape of one. He wore the same green pack he had worn since before I joined, and he had it packed the same way every time, and the straps had gone gray where his hands went. He nodded at me. I nodded at him. That was the whole of it, and that was the whole of it for 11 years. Search management is a boring science, and it has to be laid out a little here, or the rest of this is only a story about an odd old man in the woods, and it is not that. When a person goes missing in country like ours, you do not go look for them. Not first. First you sit down at a folding table with a map and you build a picture. Point last seen, point last known, direction of travel, what they were wearing, what they had with them, whether they were the kind of person who pushes on or the kind who sits down. Then you draw circles. There is math for it. There are tables built from thousands of past incidents that will tell you that a despondent adult male in mountainous terrain is found, in half of all cases, within 1 1/10 miles of the point last seen, that a hiker who is simply lost will be found within 2.5, that children under 6 go downhill and children over 10 go up, that a person will follow a drainage because water goes somewhere, and that this belief kills more people in the Smokies than bears and snakes and lightning put together, because in our mountains a drainage goes into a gorge, and the gorge goes into Laurel, and the Laurel does not go anywhere at all. From the circles you get segments, from the segments you get assignments, teams get sent to the high probability areas first, and then the next, and then the next, and every hour that passes the probability shifts and you redraw and you send them again. It is a good method. It works. Most of the people we look for are found by it, alive, cold, and embarrassed, sitting on a rock a quarter mile off a trail they lost in the dark. And when it does not work, when the days stack up and the probability map goes flat and gray and everybody knows it, the search stops being a search and becomes something else, and that something else has its own word, and the word is recovery. 19 years I have done both. Now, here is the thing about Chet Caro, of the recoveries. Not the searches, not the live finds, where the man walks out under his own power with a mylar blanket around his shoulders and cries in the parking lot. The recoveries, the ones where the search goes long and the assignments go to low probability, and the last thing anybody expects is that you will actually walk up on something. Of the last 11 recoveries our county team was involved in, Chet Caro found 9. He found the boy in the Big Creek Gorge. He found the man from Ohio in the Laurel above Groundhog Creek. He found the woman off the Low Gap, and the second man from Ohio, who was the first one's brother and who came back to look for him the next year and did not come out either. He found the college kid. He found the pair from Kentucky in the same afternoon, 40 feet apart, in a place 100 people had walked past in 3 days. 9 of 11. I did not know that number for 11 years. That is the part I have to make plain. Nobody knew it, because nobody was counting, because there is no reason on earth to count. You do not think about it that way. Each one is its own hell with its own family in a parking lot, and you go home and you take a shower and you sit in the truck in your own driveway for 20 minutes before you can go inside, and the last thing in the world you are doing is keeping a tally. The forms keep the tally, not you, the forms. Every call-out generates an incident. Every incident gets a number and a date and a time and a name for the subject and a name for the incident commander and a list of every person who signed the muster sheet and what segment they were assigned to and what they cleared and what they found. Those forms go in a banker's box. The banker's box goes on a shelf in the back of the county emergency management office in a room with a water heater in it. And there are boxes in that room going back to 1986. I had signed the top of about 200 of those forms with my own hand and never once read one back. The Snake Den call-out ran 3 days. Her name was Rennie Fitch, and she was a school counselor from Knoxville, and she had gone up on a Sunday afternoon to see the color and she had told her daughter she would be home for supper. Her car was in the lot at the trailhead with a sunshade in the windshield. We ran the first day hard. Hasty teams on the trail and the two obvious spurs, dog team on the tread, everything by the book, and we found her water bottle at about 2 miles on the uphill side, which meant she had gotten that far, and probably farther. Day 2 we widened. The probability map had her in a band between the trail and the Madron Bald Tread, and we cut that band into 11 segments, and we walked every one of them, and we came out with nothing but 2 old cans and a boot sole that had been there since the Reagan administration. Day 2, in the afternoon, it rained. Anybody who has done this in the southern Appalachians knows what that means, and it is not what the movies think. It is not that the rain washes away tracks. It is that the rain takes the country's willingness away. Rhododendron in the rain is not brush. It is a machine for stopping men. It grows in a mat 6 to 12 feet high with limbs the thickness of your wrist that all lean downhill, and you do not walk through it. You get on top of it, and you belly across it, and you fall through it, and you get up, and you do it again. And in an hour, you have made 200 yards and torn your shirt, and you cannot see the sky. We call the worst of it a hell. That is not a figure of speech. It is the actual local word. It is on the maps. Huggins Hell. Cat Hell. There are places in that park you can stand at the edge of a hell and know for a fact that no human being has ever set foot in the middle of it. Not one. Not ever. Not in the whole run of the world. Nobody searches a hell. You cannot. There is no method for it. You clear the edges, and you note it on the map, and you write in the space on the form, terrain not searchable, and you move on. And everybody at the table understands what that means, which is that if she is in there, we are not going to find her, and that is that. On day 3 at about 10 in the morning at the briefing, they put Chet Caro on a segment on the shoulder of the ridge that everybody had already been through twice. He listened to the assignment. He drank his coffee. He nodded at the search manager, a park man named Dowell who was doing a good job in a bad situation. Then he walked to the map board, and he put his finger down on a piece of green in the middle of the drainage, a piece with no trail through it and no line drawn around it, and the words terrain not searchable printed across it in Dowell's handwriting, and he said, "She is in there." Dowell said, "Chet." Chet said, "I know it. I am telling you anyhow." Dowell said, "We have talked about this." Chet drank the rest of his coffee. He said, "All right," and he took his assignment and he walked off with a young man from the park team who I think was 22 years old, and he cleared his segment. And at 3:40 in the afternoon, he keyed his radio and gave a set of coordinates that were 400 yards outside of it, at the top edge of that green, in the laurel. He had her. I was on the pack out. It took 9 of us 6 hours to bring her 400 yards. And in the middle of it, wedged in that mat with my forearms bleeding and my shoulder screaming, where I tore it in 2011, I looked over at Chet Caro, who was 60 years old, and doing the same work with no more expression on him than a fence post, and the thought went through my head clean and quick like a splinter going in. He was not surprised. Not surprised the way a man is, not surprised when he has been right about a hunch, not surprised the way you are when you find the thing you predicted. Something quieter than that and worse. He came up on her the way you come up on your own truck in a parking lot. I did not say anything to anybody. I went home and I showered and I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. But on the Saturday, I drove down to the emergency management office, and I told the woman at the desk I needed to check something in the old files for an insurance thing, and she gave me the key to the room with the water heater in it. There is a smell to a room full of paper that has never been air-conditioned. It is not mildew exactly. It is the smell of a thing that has gotten damp and dried out again 1,000 times. The smell of a cardboard box that has spent 30 summers thinking about it. The boxes were labeled by year in marker. And inside each box the incidents went in order, and each incident was a manila folder with a number written on the tab. I started with the year I turned 40 because that was the year Chet joined. I want to say what I was doing because I have had a long time to be honest with myself about it. I was not investigating anything. I did not have a theory. I had a splinter in my head and I wanted somebody to pull it out. And the somebody I wanted was a filing cabinet, and the thing I wanted it to say was that I had counted wrong. It said I had counted wrong. It said 9 of 11 was low. I built the list on the back of a well permit with a carpenter's pencil because that is what was in my truck. I did it by hand, and it took me most of 2 Saturdays because you cannot skim a search incident. Every folder has a muster sheet, and the muster sheet has 30 names on it. And you have to read down 30 names, and then you have to read the resolution page. Here is what came out of it. In 14 years, our county team had participated in 22 searches that ended in a recovery. That is inside the park and outside it, our end of the county. Everything from a hunter who fell out of a stand to a woman who walked away from a nursing home in Del Rio in January. Chet Caro was on the muster sheet for 20 of them, 20 of 22. That is not the strange part. He was on the muster sheet for 191 search callouts total, which is almost every one we ran in 14 years, because he never missed. So a man who never misses is going to be on the sheet for every recovery too. That is just arithmetic, and it is not sinister. Here is the sinister part. The resolution page has a box on it. It is a small box near the bottom of the second page, and it says subject located by, and then there is a line, and on the line somebody writes a name. Of the 22 recoveries, that line said Caro C 17 times. 17. Twice it said dog team. Once it said aerial. Once it said fisherman. And that was the man in the Pigeon River in 2015 who was not really ours. And once it said Gantry R, and that was a boy on Round Mountain in my second year as team leader who was 50 feet off the trail and would have been found by whoever walked past next. And I have never in my life felt less like I found anybody. I sat on an upturned bucket in a room with a water heater in it, and I looked at that pencil list on the back of a well permit for a long time. 17 of 22 over 14 years on a team that runs a search with 30 to 100 people on the ground. There is a thing you can do with numbers like that, and I did it that night at my kitchen table with Dana asleep upstairs. If you have got, call it 50 searchers on an average recovery, and every one of them has the same chance of walking up on the subject, then any one man ought to be the finder about 1 time in 50. Chet was 1 man out of 50, and he was the finder 4 times in 5. I did it 3 different ways, because I did not trust myself. It does not matter how you do it. The number that comes out the other end has a lot of zeros. After the decimal point and before the first digit, that is not a 0. The thing that hit me was not the odds. It was the 6th Saturday, when I went back for the last box, and I sat down, and I read the 17 resolution pages again, and I read the little narrative paragraph at the bottom of each one where the finder describes the circumstances of the find. 14 of the 17 carried a version of the same line. Subject located outside assigned segment. Chet Caro had been walking off his assignment for 14 years. Every incident commander in 3 counties knew it. Dowell knew it. That was the meaning of, we have talked about this. They knew it, and they wrote it down, and they filed it, and they gave him a segment again the next time because he found people, and because if you are the man at the folding table with a family standing in the parking lot, you do not much care about the paperwork. Nobody had ever put the 17 folders next to each other because there is no reason to and no way to. They are in different boxes, different years, different water heaters. The system was never designed to answer the question I was asking, and I only asked it because I saw a man's face in the laurel and something in me went cold. I want to say now, plainly, what I thought I thought Chet Caro was killing them. I sat at my table at 1 in the morning, and I let myself think it all the way through. 19 years, and I have carried out people I knew. I have carried out a girl I taught in Sunday school. I have knelt in the rain and helped a father identify a coat. And I thought about a lean old man who was always already there when I got to the staging area, and who packed the same green pack the same way every time, and who walked off his assignment for 14 years and came back with somebody's daughter. There is a phrase in the fire service, and I have heard it in law enforcement too, and it is one of the ugliest phrases in the English language because of how much true, awful history is packed into it. The arsonist is the first man on scene. There is a whole literature on it. Volunteers who set fires so that they can put them out. Nurses who make patients sick so they can be there for the code. It is not rare enough to be interesting. It is common. It has a name. Every arson investigator in America knows to take a hard look at the man in the crowd who is watching the house go up with his hands in his pockets and a strange peace on his face. Then put that man on a search team. He would not even have to be strong. He would not have to be young. Most of the people we look for do the hard part themselves. They walk off a trail in the dark. They slip. They sit down against a tree and go to sleep in 40-degree rain with cotton on. Half of the recoveries I have been on, the cause of death is exposure, and the coroner writes it in a hand that has written it 1,000 times. All a man would have to do is be there. Be there in the dark when the subject is confused and cold and terrified and has been walking in a circle for 3 hours. Be a voice. Be a shape with a light. Say, "Hey there." Say, "You have come a long way off the trail." Say, "Come with me." And then walk her 400 yards into a hell where no one has ever set foot, and where the incident commander will write, in the box provided, "Terrain not searchable." And then wait 3 days. I got up from the table, and I went outside and stood in the yard with no coat on until I was cold enough to stop, because the thing that was in my chest was not fear. My son Elias was 17 that fall. He had done his ground searcher class in the summer, and he had his card in his wallet, and he had been on 4 call-outs as a trainee, walking the tread with a whistle, and he wanted more than anything on this earth to be on a team. And the man he had been assigned to shadow on the snake den search, the man he came home and talked about at supper with his ears red, was Chet Caro. I went to see a man named Farrell Boyce. Boyce had been a sergeant with the county for 31 years, and he had run the detective side of it for the last 12, and he had retired to a brick house outside Newport, with a shop out back where he restored outboard motors, which is a hobby for a man who wants to be alone with a small problem that can be solved. He knew me. He had signed off on 100 of my forms. I did not tell him about the pencil list. I asked him whether there had ever been anything on Chet Caro. He wiped his hands on a rag and he looked at me for a while, and then he said, "Sit down, Gantry." He told me that in 2015, before I was team leader, the park had asked the county to take a quiet look at a volunteer who kept finding bodies. He said, "Quiet look." He said, "That means 2 men in a car for a while and a records check and nothing on paper." He said Chet Caro had been born in 1964 in Cock County, never married, worked 30 years for the state highway department cutting brush and running a mower on the shoulder of Interstate 40 and then on the county roads. Retired at 55 with a bad back. No arrests. Nothing. Not a speeding ticket. He lived on 11 acres, up Wilton Springs, that his mother left him. Boyce said, "We looked at where he was on the days those people went missing. Not the days they were found. The days they went missing." He said, "That is the whole thing right there, and most people never think of it. A man who finds bodies is only interesting if he was standing somewhere near them when they stopped being people." Chet Caro, in 2015, had a time card. Boyce said the state highway department keeps a card for every hour a man is on a mower. He said they pulled 4 years of them. He said that on the afternoon, the boy went missing in the Big Creek Gorge. Chet Caro was on a mower on Highway 25, in front of 6 other men. He said that on the day the woman went off the low gap, Chet was in a hospital in Knoxville having a disc taken out of his back. He said he was not there, not for any of the ones we could check, not for one. I sat in that shop and I felt something go out of me, and I could not tell whether it was relief, Boyce said. And then he said, the thing I have thought about most. He said, so we closed it. And I will tell you what has bothered me for 10 years, and it is not that we might have been wrong. We were not wrong. It is that in the whole time we were looking at him, I never once asked myself the other question. I said, what other question? He said, if he is not putting them there, then how in the name of God does he know where they are? He picked up a carburetor and he put it down again. He said, I asked him, sat with him at his kitchen table. I said, Chet, how do you find them? And he looked at me like I had asked him how he breathed. And he said, I go where they are. Boyce said, and that was the end of it, and I never went back up there, and I would like it very much if you did not tell anybody I ever said any of this to you. I followed Chet Caro for 11 days in November. I am not proud of it. I told Dana I was running a jetting job over in Del Rio. I sat in a gravel pullout below his place on Wilton Springs Road with a thermos, and when his truck came down, I gave it a mile and I went after it. 6 of those 11 days he drove into the park. There was no call-out. There had not been a call-out since the snake den. There was no missing person in Cott County or Sevier County or across the line in Haywood, and I know that because I checked every morning. He parked at the Big Creek Ranger Station. He parked at Cosby. He parked twice at a pullout on 1562, where there is not even a trail, just a stand of hemlock and a bank down to the water. Every time he took the green pack out of the bed of the truck and he shrugged it on and he walked into the woods, and he came out between 6 and 9 hours later, and he put the pack back in the bed and he drove home. He was 60 years old and he was doing 9-hour days in country that put a 30-year-old man on his knees on his own time in November, alone, for nothing. On the 11th day, I did not follow his truck. I got there first, and I hiked in on the low gap trail before light, and I sat down on a rock 100 yards off the tread where I could see the trail through the trees, and I waited. He came by at 7:50. He did not look at me, and I do not know to this day whether he saw me. I gave him 10 minutes, and I went after him. At about a mile and a half, he left the trail. He did not look around first. He did not slow down. He came to a place that looked like every other place, a bank of laurel with a gap in it the size of a dog door, and he turned 90 degrees, and he went into it on his hands and knees, and he was gone. I sat down where the trail was, and I put my hand on my knee, and I found that my hand was not steady. Then I went in after him. I lost him in 11 minutes. Of course I did. I got maybe 200 yards into that mat, and the light went brown, and the ground disappeared under a raft of limbs, and I could not tell up from down, and I could not hear anything but my own breath and the creak of green wood, and there was nothing anywhere to tell me which way was the trail. I sat down. That is the only thing you can do. I sat in a rhododendron hell on a wet slope with my heart going, and I waited to be less stupid. 20 minutes later, a man's boot came down about 8 feet from my head. Chet Caro lay down on the mat above me, on his belly, in a way that told me he had done it 10,000 times, and he looked down at me through the limbs. He said, "You have got about 1,100 feet of fall below you, and you would not stop for the first 400. I said, "I know." He said, "No, you do not. Nobody does. That is the whole trouble." He got me out. It took him 40 minutes, and he did not say one word the entire time except left and up and hold on to that. We came out onto the trail, and I sat down in the dirt with my back against a poplar, and I was shaking, and I was crying a little, and I hated it. Chet sat down across the trail from me, and he took his hat off and set it on his knee. He said, "Ask me." So I asked him. I said, "How do you know where they are?" And Chet Caro said, "Because I know where he puts them." He did not say it like a man delivering a line. He said it the way you tell a neighbor which way the water runs on his property. Then he waited to see what I would do with it, and when I did not do anything with it, he put his hat back on and stood up and said, "Come to the house Saturday. Bring your own coffee. Mine is bad." His house was a white frame house with a tin roof and a porch that had been rebuilt by somebody who knew what he was doing. There was a woodpile under a tarp with the round stacked bark down so the rain would run off, which is a thing my father did and almost nobody does anymore. Inside it was clean and it was empty, in the way a house gets when one person has lived in it alone for 30 years. 2 chairs at a table for 4. 1 coat on a hook that had 4 hooks. On the table there were 9 notebooks. They were the marbled composition kind, the kind you buy at a drugstore in August for $1, and they were numbered on the covers in ballpoint, and the first one had a date on it from 26 years ago. Chet sat down across from me and pushed the first one over and said, "Do not skip. It will not make sense if you skip." I read for 6 hours. He made lunch at some point and put it beside my elbow, and I ate it without tasting it. The notebooks are a search log. That is all they are. There is no confession in them. There is nothing in them that a jury would look at twice. They are the most patient document I have ever handled. The early ones are just walking. Dates and routes and weather. He was in his 30s then, working a mower on the highway all day and walking the park on Sundays because he had nothing else, and he wrote down where he went the way a man keeps a fishing log. Then in 1999, on a Sunday in March, off the Gabes Mountain Trail, he found a body. Nobody was looking for her. She had not been reported. He walked up on her in the Laurel 400 yards off the tread, and she had been there some months. And he hiked out and he called it in from a payphone in Cosby, and he waited by the road for the deputies, and they took his name. That was the first one. He wrote 3 pages about her that night, and one line of it is the reason for everything that came after. He wrote, "Her boots were clean on the bottom. I did not understand it. I read past it, and then I came back to it. You cannot walk 400 yards through a rhododendron hell on a wet slope in March and come out with clean boot soles. You cannot walk 40 feet. The mat holds a soup of black leaf mold under it that is a foot deep in places, and it gets into everything. My own boots that day had it up over the welt." He wrote, "Her boots were clean on the bottom, and there was mold packed under the collar of her jacket at the back of her neck. Under the collar, at the back of the neck, because if you take a person by the wrists and you drag them face up through that country, the mat combs the mold up off the ground and packs it in behind their head." Chet Caro, 35 years old, sitting at that same table at midnight in 1999, wrote a paragraph in a dollar notebook explained to nobody how he knew that a woman had not walked to the place where she was lying. And then, being who he was, he wrote down what he would look for next time. The notebooks after that are a study. He never uses that word. He never uses any word bigger than he needs. He built a picture over 26 years, the way we build a probability map at a folding table in a gravel lot out of nothing but data and patience, and he built it alone, and he was better at it than every search manager I have ever worked under. And here is the summary of what a man who ran a brush mower for the state highway department worked out on his Sundays. The places are not random. They are hells, always, because a hell is a hole in the search. But not just any hell. They are hells that lie within about a half mile of an old road. The park is full of them. Nobody thinks about it. Before it was a park, it was farms and logging camps and whole towns. 6,000 people lived in there, and when the government bought them out in the 30s, the roads did not go anywhere. They just quit being used. Grade beds. Rail beds from the logging outfits. Old wagon tracks that are now a bench of level ground in the woods with poplars 14 inches through growing out of the middle of them. You cannot see them from the trail. You can see them from 100 feet up on the slope above if you know what a road looks like when it has been dead for 90 years. And Chet Caro had spent 30 years mowing the shoulders of roads, and he could see them from anywhere. He wrote, "He carries them in on the grade, and then he goes downhill into the hell, because downhill with a load is the only way a man can do it, and he does not come back the same way." He wrote, "He does not go far. 400 yards, 600 at the outside. It is always right at the edge of the distance the search will write off." He wrote, and this is on page 40 of the 5th notebook, and I have it word for word because I asked him for a copy of that page, and I still have it in my truck. He knows how we search. He has known it for years. He knows what the incident commander is going to write in that box before the incident commander knows it. He is not hiding them from us. He is putting them in the place we have already agreed not to look. There is one more thing in the notebooks, and it is on a page by itself in the 7th one, dated 11 years ago. He had been walking a grade above Snake Den in the fall, and he had stopped to sit down, and the log he sat on was a hollow poplar, dead and standing, with a split up the back of it that a man could reach into. Inside it, up off the ground, and out of the wet, there was a tarp, green, 12 by 16, with brass grommets, and it had a length of half-inch rope run through 4 of the grommets at one end and knotted, and the rope was worn shiny for about 3 feet back from the knots. He wrote down the dimensions, he wrote down the color, he drew the knot, which was a bowline tied by somebody who could tie one in the dark. Then he wrote, "I put it back the way it was, and I closed the split with the same piece of bark, and I have not been back." I sat at his kitchen table, and I read that page, and I said, 11 years. Chet said, yes. I said, you could have watched it. You could have sat on that ridge for a season with a pair of binoculars, and you would have had him. And Chet Carroll looked at me the way a man looks at a child who has just explained to him how to run his own trade. He said, and then what? He said, say I see him. Say I get his face. I am a man with no job and no wife and no witness who has just told the sheriff that he has been watching a tarp in a tree for a year and that he knows where 11 bodies are and that he did not report 7 of them. He said, they arrested me that afternoon and the tarp is still in the tree. He said, I made a trade. I do not know if it was the right one. I decided a long time ago that I would rather bring back the ones I can find than have my name in a newspaper for a year, and I have never once been sure about it, and there is nobody I could ask. He said, I am asking you. I did not answer him. That is the truth. I sat in a clean, empty kitchen in front of an old man who had carried the worst secret in 3 counties for a quarter of a century, and he asked me the only question he had ever asked anybody, and I did not answer him. And 8 weeks later, I put a pencil list on a folding table and took his card. I put the notebook down. I said, Chet, how many? He said, I do not know. I said, guess. He said, no. We sat there. Then he said, I have found 11 that were put. I have found 13 more that were not, that just died the way people die, and I can tell the difference every time, and I am not wrong. He said, of the 11, 4 of them were on searches, and 7 of them nobody was ever looking for, and that is the number to think about tonight. 7 people in 26 years who nobody was ever looking for. I said, why, in God's name, have you never told anybody? And Chet Carroll looked at me with those flat, weathered eyes, and he said, Pharaoh Boyce sat where you were sitting in 2015 and asked me how I find them. He said, and I looked at that man, and I understood that I had about 1 sentence before I was the answer to his question. He said, a man walks up on 11 bodies in the woods. That man is not a witness. There is no version of it where he is a witness. He is the thing they have been looking for. He said, and if they took me for it, they would stop. Everybody would stop. They would close the ones they could close, and they would call the rest exposure. And there would not be 1 single person left in the state of Tennessee who was walking those old grades on a Sunday in November looking for a place where the laurel is bent the wrong way. Then he said the sentence that I have not been able to put down since. He said, Gantry, I am not trying to catch him. I never once thought I could. I am trying to bring them home. That is all this is. Somebody has to be the one who goes and gets them, and it has to be somebody nobody will believe, or he would have quit doing it years ago. I drove home that night on the Foothills Parkway with the window down in November because I needed the cold. And I did the thing I did. 2 weeks later, I sat down in a meeting with Dowell from the park and the county emergency management director, and I laid the pencil list on the table. I told them a member of my team had been walking off assignment for 14 years. I told them he had located 17 of 22 recoveries. I told them he was following searchers' families and hiking alone in the park on days with no call-out, and that I had followed him for 11 days and could document it. I did not tell them about the notebooks. I have asked myself 10,000 times why not, and the answer is not complicated, and it does me no credit. If I had put those notebooks on that table, one of 2 things happens. Either they believe them, in which case The county has a serial murderer in the Smokies, and that is a thing that will be on the national news and will take 4 years and will end with nothing, because there is no evidence and never was. Or they do not believe them. And I sat in that meeting and I looked at the emergency management director, a decent man named Purnell who had a picture of his grandkids on the wall, and I knew exactly which one it was going to be. And I understood that Chet Caro had been right for 10 years, and that I was about to prove it for him. I gave them the numbers, and I left the man out. They pulled his card in January. It was not a hearing. It was a letter. And the letter said that after a review of team operations, and it used the word liability, and it thanked him for his service. Elias cried about it. 17 years old, and he sat at the supper table with his fists in his eyes. Dana looked at me across the table, and she did not say anything at all, because she had watched me build that pencil list, and she had never once asked to see it, and she has never asked me about it since. I told myself I did it for my son. I have had a long time to think about that, and it is about a third true. The call-out came in on the 22nd of March. Girl of 19, a freshman at a college in Cullowhee, up for the weekend with 3 friends who came back to the car at dark and waited 2 hours before one of them drove down to the gate and got a bar of signal and called 911. Her name was Aubrey Lands, and her mother drove up from Silva that night and stood in the gravel lot at Cosby with a jacket on over her nightgown. We ran it the way you run one. Point last seen at the Hen Wallow Falls Junction at 3 in the afternoon. She had gone on ahead. That is all it takes. She went on ahead and she got to a place where the trail crosses a bench and a footpath goes off the wrong way, an old fisherman's path, and it looks exactly as much like the trail as the trail does. Day 1 we had 60 people. Day 2 we had 140 in a helicopter and 3 dog teams and a man from Knoxville with a drone. Day 3 the probability map went flat. I sat at the folding table with Dowell and we redrew it, and the numbers would not go anywhere, and the segments we had left were the ones you leave for last, which are the ones on the map with green on them and nothing else. Day 4, Dowell wrote terrain not searchable across the Cat Hell drainage in blue marker, and he did it because it was true. Day 5, they scaled it back to 20 people. Day 7, it went to limited continuous, which is a phrase that means we will look at it when we have time. Her mother went back to Silva. There is a photograph of her at the gate that ran in the Knoxville paper, and I have never been able to look at it. On the 9th of April, I drove up Wilton Springs Road, and I knocked on a white frame house with a tin roof. He opened the door, and he looked at me, and he did not say anything. I said, "Chet?" He said, "I know." I said, "Will you come?" And he stood in that doorway a long while, and I watched an old man decide something. He said, "Get your pack." We went in before light on the 10th of April, up the Gabes Mountain Trail, off it at 2 miles, and then Chet Caro put me on a piece of ground I would have sworn was a natural bench, and he stood on it and said, "Road." And then I saw it. Once he said it, I could not unsee it. Level. A cut bank on the uphill side, softened by 90 years, but a cut. Poplars in a line down the middle of it, because that is where the light came down when the trees on both sides were already tall. It went along the contour into the trees and out of sight, and it went on that way, he told me, for 2.5 miles. And it had been built by a logging outfit in 1927 to bring chestnut down off that ridge, and there was not one line of it on any map that had been printed in 80 years. We walked it for an hour and a half. Then Chet stopped. He was looking downhill. He said, "Here." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because that is where I would go." He went in first. It took us 2 hours to make 500 yards. There was a place where the mat had been broken about a foot off the ground, and the break was maybe 2 weeks healed, which in a rhododendron means the leaves on the broken limb have gone from green to brown, but not yet let go. He did not point at it. He just went that way. We found her at 11:40 in the morning at the bottom of a slot where the laurel met the rock, and she was face up, and she had been there 19 days, and her boots were clean on the bottom. I got down on my knees in that mat, and I put my hand over my mouth, and I stayed like that a while. Chet did not touch her. He took out a compass, and he shot a bearing off a bare snag on the ridge, and he wrote it in a notebook, and then he sat back on his heels, and he looked up the slope the way we had come. He said, "We are going to hike out, and we are going to call the sheriff, and you are going to tell them you found her, because you are on the team, and I am not. And because if I call this in from a payphone in Cosby for the 12th time in my life, they will put me in a room and they will not let me out." And then he stopped talking. I looked at him. He was still looking uphill. I turned around and I looked uphill. There was nothing. Green light and the mat and the wet gray limbs going up out of sight, and the sound of a creek somewhere under our feet, because in a hell the water runs under the mat and you can hear it all day and never see it. And then about 70 feet above us, one limb moved. Not a swaying, not the wind, and there was no wind under there. There is never any wind under there. It went down about 6 inches and it came back up the way a limb does when a hand comes off it. We did not run. There is nowhere to run in that country, and both of us knew it. And a man on his belly in a rhododendron mat is not a man. He is a slow thing with a soft back. Chet Caro stood up. He stood all the way up on that mat so that he was chest high out of the leaves. And he looked up the slope and he said in a normal voice, not loud, the voice you would use to a dog you did not like, "I have been coming out here 26 years. Nothing." He said, "I have got her now. I have got all of them but 4. Nothing." Then he said something I have never told anybody, and it was not to me. He said, "I know about the tarp and the poplar." And up the slope, in a place where no man has ever set foot, not one, not ever, not in the whole run of the world, something began to move away. Slow, steady, downhill, and to the east, along a line that would put it in about a mile back on that grade. It did not hurry. That is the part I have never gotten out from under. It did not hurry. We hiked out. I called the sheriff. I told them I found her. I told them I had gone up on my own to walk the edge of the cat hell segment, and that I had gotten a feeling and I had pushed in. They wrote it down. Dowell shook my hand at the trailhead and could not look at me while he did it, because he thought I was covering for Chet Caro, and I let him think it. The coroner ruled exposure. I stood in that office and I asked him about the soles of her boots, and he was a decent man, and he was tired, and he said, "Son, she was 19 days in a rhododendron thicket," and he had a stack on his desk, and he was not wrong to say it. There was mold under the collar of her jacket at the back of her neck. I know because I looked, and I looked because a man who ran a brush mower for the state highway department taught me where to look. I did not say anything about that either. I have never said it to anybody in an official capacity in my life, because Chet was right about the whole of it, all the way down, and I had proved him right with my own 2 hands in a meeting in January. In June I went to find the poplar. I had the notebook page with me, and the grade and the drawing of the knot. It took me 2 Sundays. The tree was there, dead and standing, and split up the back, exactly as he had drawn it, and the piece of bark was set into the split the way you would set a stone in a wall. I lifted it out. The tarp was gone. There was a dry dust of rotted rope fiber in the bottom of the hollow, and a place where the wood was worn smooth in a band about 6 inches wide, the way a stair tread wears, and I put my hand flat on it. I have thought about what that means, and there are 2 answers, and I do not know which one it is. Either he moved it because Chet said the word tarp out loud on a mountainside in April, or he moved it 11 years ago the same week because he came back and found a piece of bark set into a split by a hand that was not his, and he has known since then that somebody knew, and he has spent 11 years watching a lean old man walk the grades on Sundays and doing his work anyway in the same country, 400 yards apart, both of them careful, both of them quiet, both of them the only person the other one had. Chet Caro went missing on the 19th of October. There was no call-out for 2 days because there was nobody to notice. He lived alone on 11 acres, and the mail piled up in the box at the road, and it was a woman from the water company who saw it and called the sheriff. His truck was at the Big Creek Ranger Station. It had a parking tag on the dash, filled out in his handwriting, with the date and his name and the box checked for day use. They ran a search. I want to say that for the record. They ran a good one. Cock County and the park and 2 teams down from Knoxville, and it went 4 days, and I was on it, and Dowell was the incident commander, and he did everything right. Point last seen was the truck, 62-year-old male, experienced, no known medical, no note, no financial trouble, no reason. The tables will tell you that an experienced, despondent male in mountainous terrain goes about 2 miles. We drew the circles. We cut the segments. We walked them. On the 4th day, I sat at the folding table with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and I watched Dowell take a blue marker and write terrain not searchable across a piece of green on the north side of Mount Sterling Ridge. And he capped the marker and set it down on the table, and neither of us said one word. They scaled it back on the 6th day. On the 8th day, a Sunday, I got up at 4 in the morning, and I did not wake Dana, and I drove to the Big Creek Ranger Station, and I parked next to nothing because his truck was in evidence, and I put on the green pack, which his sister in Morristown had let me take out of the house along with 9 composition notebooks, and I walked in. I did not go to any of the segments. I went uphill off the tread about 600 feet, and I stood in the trees, and I turned around slow with the light coming up gray behind me, and I looked for a line. I found it in about 20 minutes. Level. A cut bank on the uphill side, softened. Poplars in a row down the middle of it. I walked that grade for 2 hours. I went slow. There was a piece of my mind that was screaming the whole time, and I let it scream, and I kept walking, and I watched the downhill side, and I watched for a hell. I found 4. I stood at the lip of each one, and I looked down into it, and I asked myself the question. At the 4th one, I did not have to ask. There was no broken limb. There was no sign of any kind. It was a slot in the mountain with a rock face on the far side of it, and the laurel poured down into it like water into a sink, and it went dark about 80 feet in, and it was maybe 500 yards from where I stood to the bottom of it. I stood there for probably 10 minutes, because that is where I would go. That was the whole of it. That was the entire process. 26 years of a man's Sundays, and it comes down to a sentence you can say to yourself in a second and a half, and once you can say it, you can never not say it again, and it will be there when you look at a hillside for the rest of your life. I went down. It took me 3 hours because I am not the man he was. I fell twice. I got turned around once and had to sit down and wait for my head to clear. I found him at the bottom, on his back, in the leaves, 400 yards in. He had been there 10 days. I am not going to describe him. He was a man who did his work, and he had a face like a fence post, and he pulled me out of a hell with 40 minutes and 4 words, and I will not put him on display. His boots were clean. On the bottom, there was leaf mold packed under the collar of his jacket at the back of his neck, in a wedge, the way it goes when a man is dragged face up. I sat down next to him in that place, and I did not do anything for a long time. The creek ran under the mat. I could hear it, and I could not see it. Then I hiked out and I drove to a payphone at the store in Cosby, which is the last payphone in that end of the county, and I called the sheriff and I told them where he was. They asked me how I found him. I said, I went where he was. I sat on the tailgate of my truck in the parking lot of that store, and I waited for the deputies, and I watched the cars go by on Highway 32, and I understood that I was now the only man alive who could do this, and that this was the reason it had to be one man, and that it had never once been a coincidence. He does not need to hide them from all of us. He only needs to hide them from the method. The method is a good method, and it works, and it is written in a manual and taught in a 2-day class in a fire hall, and it will find your lost child in the dark and bring her out crying and cold. And it has a box on the second page of a form for the places it has agreed to leave alone. And there has to be one man who does not use the method. And the moment that man stands up and says what he knows, he stops being useful, because the county puts him in a room, and the room is where he will be for 4 years while nothing happens and the grades go back to being empty on Sundays. Chet Caro understood that when he was 35 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with a dollar notebook, and he made his choice, and he kept it for 26 years without one word to another living soul. And then a man with a pencil list and a 17-year-old son took his card away in January, and he came anyway when I knocked on his door. The coroner ruled it exposure. The sheriff's file says that a retired highway department employee with a documented back injury hiked into difficult terrain alone in October and became disoriented and succumbed to the elements. It says he had a history of unauthorized solo searching. It says his participation with the county team had been terminated for cause the previous winter. Everything in it is true. I go on Sundays. Now, Dana knows. I told her the whole of it. One night in the kitchen, and it took me until 3 in the morning, and she sat there with her hands around a cup and let me get to the end of it. Then she said, "Do you have to?" I said I did. She said, "All right." She said, "Be back for supper." And then she went upstairs, and I heard her crying through the floor, and I sat down in the chair by the door and put my boots back on, because there was nothing else in the world for me to do with my hands. Elias is 23. He is a lineman for the electric co-op, and he is better at heights than I ever was, and he has a girl he is going to marry. He has asked me twice to take him with me. The first time I said no, and I did not give him a reason. The second time was last April, in the driveway, with the truck running, and he stood there in the cold with his arms crossed, and he said, "Dad, I know where you go." And I looked at my son, and I thought about a limb 70 feet up, a slope going down 6 inches and coming back up, and about how it did not hurry. And I said, "When I am too old to walk it, I will show you what a road looks like after 90 years, and I will show you the difference between a woman who lay down and a woman who was carried. And after that, you will not be able to look at a mountain the same way as long as you live, and there will not be anybody to take it back off you." He said, "Okay." He said, "So, not yet." I said, "Not yet." And I put the truck in gear, and I drove up to the park with the green pack in the bed and a compass and 9 composition notebooks and a dry bag on the seat beside me. And I parked, and I walked in, and I went uphill 600 feet and turned around slow with the light coming up gray behind me, looking for a line. The moths were bad that night, so I had the headlamp on the red setting, and I was standing on the porch of the cabin at Indian Creek with the clipboard tipped toward the light, saying the names out loud the way I did. The radio on the shelf behind me broke squelch, and a voice came out of it that I did not immediately know. It was a woman, and she was calling the Indian Creek station, and she was calling from Pungo Creek Camp, mile 38. I picked up the mic and I said, "Go ahead." She said, "This is going to sound strange." She said, "We are at Pungo. There are people here." I looked at the clipboard. Pungo Creek Camp was assigned that night to the Bergstrom party. 6 people. Private trip out of Boise. And she was Karen Bergstrom. And I had checked her permit myself at 10:40 that morning. And she had been friendly and competent, and she had a bad sunburn on the tops of her feet. I said, "Karen, how many?" She said, "I do not know." We came around the corner and there was a fire on the beach. She said, "We did not land. We are half a mile down at Whitey Cox, and we are on the beach here, and we are fine, but Whitey Cox belongs to somebody, does it not?" It did not. Whitey Cox was blank that night, and blank the night before, and blank the night after, and I stood there with the clipboard in my hand, and I did not tell her that, and I could not have said why. I stood there on that porch with the clipboard in my hand, and I ran it, and I ran it again, and I want to describe what happened in my body, because it was not fear yet, it was much stranger than that. There was nobody upstream of the Bergstroms who was not accounted for. There were 3 parties between Indian Creek and Pungo that night, and I had their names and their beaches. There were 4 parties below. There was nobody floating, nobody was late, nobody was early, and nobody in the state of Idaho had put a boat on the middle fork of the Salmon that day who had not stood on the sand at Boundary Creek in front of a ranger and had their fire pan looked at, and a boat cannot get to Pungo Creek from below. I keyed the mic, and I said, "Karen, was there a boat on the beach?" There was a long pause. "River radio is line of sight and bad, and it takes a while." She said no. She said, "Deal, there was no boat." I told her to stay at Whitey Cox and to keep a light on and to call me at 7 in the morning, and I went inside and I sat down on the bunk and I did not turn on the lamp. Camp assignment on the Middle Fork works like this. Nobody owns a camp. You put in a preference at the launch site and the ranger writes it on a sheet, and by the time the last boat is rigged that morning, the whole 100 miles of river has been divided up and written down in a hand that better be legible, because for the next 6 days, every party on that water is going to run their day around it. Rat Camp, Pistol Creek, Sheep Creek, Cove, Wilson, Bernard, Ouzel, Survey, Cutthroat. Names that mean nothing to anybody who has not been down there and everything to everybody who has. You get a camp, and it is yours, from the time you land until the time you shove off. Nobody else in the world can put a boat on that beach. That is the whole social contract of the river, and I have never once seen a man break it on purpose. And the current runs one way. That is the other thing, and it is the thing that took me the whole summer to understand that I did not understand. The Middle Fork of the Salmon falls 3,000 feet in 96 miles. It is a pool drop river in the upper reaches, and it is a long green freight train in the lower canyon. And in July it moves at about 4.5 miles an hour, and in June it moves at 7. You cannot go up it. Not with a raft, not with a dory, not with an outboard, because motors are not allowed and would not help you anyway in Weber or in rubber. Not on foot along the bank, because there is no bank, because in most of that canyon the rock goes into the water at an angle that will make you very tired and then very wet. There is a trail. There is a good trail on the west side for a lot of it, and there are stock bridges, and there is an airstrip at Indian Creek and one at Thomas Creek. So it is not sealed. Nothing in the Frank Church is sealed. But it is one way. Everything and everybody on that river got on at the top at Boundary Creek and is going to get off at the bottom at Cash Bar, and in between there are 3 checkpoints where a man in a green shirt writes your name on a clipboard. My name is Deal, and I was the man in the green shirt at Indian Creek for 4 seasons, which means that on any given morning in July I could stand on that beach with a cup of coffee and tell you exactly how many human beings were on the Middle Fork of the Salmon between me and the main. I could tell you their names. I could tell you what color their boats were, and how many kids they had, and which one of them was going to swim Tappan, and which one was going to be fine. 52 people, say. 7 parties. 100 miles of the deepest country in Idaho. And I have got a clipboard, and the clipboard is complete. I want to be very careful and very clear about that. It was not a feeling. It was not a job I did well. It was arithmetic. Every party launches at Boundary. Every party is checked at Boundary by a ranger with a permit and a head count and a fire pan inspection. Every party is checked again by me at Indian Creek at mile 25. Every party is checked out at Cash Bar. If the numbers do not match at Cash Bar, the phone rings in Chalice and helicopters start. Nobody comes onto that river in the middle. There is nowhere to put in. There is no road. There has not been a road since 1930-something. And the reason there has not been a road is that in 1980, they drew a line around 2.33 million acres and called it wilderness. And it is the largest piece of country in the lower 48 where a machine has never been. So when I say I knew where everybody was, that is what I mean. I got the Indian Creek job the way a man gets any seasonal job in Idaho, which is by knowing somebody. I had guided for 11 years for an outfit out of salmon, oars, and a paddle boat, and a sweep on the high water trips. And I was 34, and my knees had begun to give me the kind of information a man does not want. And there was a woman named Jill in Salmon, who I had been not quite married to for 4 years. And the guiding season kept me on the water 26 days a month. She did not ask me to quit. She never once asked me. She just started making plans without me, quietly, the way you do. And by her second summer alone, she had a whole life running parallel to mine, like the second lane of a road. And one October I came home, and she had bought a couch by herself. The Indian Creek post was 2 weeks on and 1 week off. It was a step down in money, and it was a step toward a person, and I took it, and it did not save anything. And Jill moved to Bozeman in my third season, and I stayed on that beach for a fourth. I am putting this down because it is the reason I was alone that much, and it is the reason I paid attention. A man with somebody waiting on him does not sit on a rock at 10 at night looking at a clipboard. Indian Creek is a bar on the west side at River Mile 25, where a creek comes in through a slot. There is a dirt airstrip on the bench above it, 3,000 feet of it, and a windsock, and there is a cabin and a ranger station and a corral, and there are 2 toilets, which on that river makes it a metropolis. Most of what the job is nothing. Parties come through in the late morning. Most days, between 11 and 2, you will get 4 or 5 of them, and they land and stretch their legs and use the toilet and buy nothing because there is nothing to buy. And you go boat to boat, and you check the permit, and you check the fire pan and the groover and the strainer, and you count heads, and you write the number down, and then they get back on the water and the river takes them, and by 2:30 the beach is empty, and it is just you and the wind in the Ponderosa and the sound of Indian Creek coming down through the rocks. I read a lot. I did some maintenance. In the evenings, I would take the department john boat, which was for emergencies, and which I was not supposed to run for fun, up the 50 yards of flat water in front of the beach and back down, just to be moving. And every night before I went into the cabin, I would take the clipboard off the nail on the porch post, and I would go down the sheet, and I would say the names out loud. That was not a ritual when I started. It became one. 4 seasons will do that. Bergstrom Party, 6. Pungo tonight. Loon Creek tomorrow. Idaho Afloat, 22. Marble Creek. The 2 brothers in the hardshell kayaks with no name for their party, because there were only 2 of them, at Cutthroat. 52 people. 7 parties. 100 miles. Everybody in a bed. Karen Bergstrom called at 7 the next morning, and she sounded like a woman who had not slept, because she had not. She said, "We went back up." I said, "You what?" She said, "Ross and my brother-in-law went back up on the trail this morning at first light. It is a mile they wanted to see." I did not say anything, and she took that for what it was, and she said, "I know." I said, "What did they find?" She said, "A fire ring." She said, "It is a real one. It is one of the ones that is always there. But there was fresh ash in it, and it was still warm at 6:30 in the morning, and there were rocks set around a place in the sand at the head of the beach where somebody had slept." And Ross said the sand was pressed down in the shape of a man. She said, "That is all. Nothing was taken from us, and we did not have anything down there to take. There was no trash. There was no boat. There were no tracks on the beach going anywhere, except from the fire to the trail." Then she said, "Deal. The trail goes upriver." I told her that people hike the Middle Fork trail all the time, which is true, and that it was almost certainly a backpacker who did not know the camps are reserved, which is also a thing that happens, and that I would look into it. I said that in the voice you use, and she heard the voice, and she thanked me, and they got on the water at 8, and they had a good week, and I never spoke to Karen Bergstrom again in my life. Here is what I did about it that day, and it was the right thing to do, and it took me 11 minutes, and it turned up nothing, which is exactly how these things go. I got Boundary Creek on the radio, and I asked them to read me the last 4 days of launches. They did. 7 parties, 91 people. Every one of them checked, every one of them through my beach, every head count matching. I asked whether anybody had walked in. The Middle Fork Trail leaves the road at Boundary and runs down the west side of the canyon. It gets used. Steelhead fishermen in the fall, hunters, and about a dozen backpackers a summer, most of them going down, some going up from the Flying Bee Ranch airstrip. Boundary said there had been 2 backpackers in the last week, and both had signed the register at the trailhead, and both had gone down, and both had come out on the Sheep Eater Trail on the 6th. I asked whether anybody had flown into Indian Creek or Thomas Creek. 2 planes at Indian Creek in the last week, and I had watched both of them land from my own porch. I made a note in the station log. I wrote, "Party at Pungo reports, unassigned camper, possible backpacker, no contact, no damage." 9 words, more or less, and it went into a logbook, and the logbook goes in a box, and the box goes to Chalice. I want to say that I did not think about it again for 11 days, and that is not quite true. I thought about it the way you think about a bill you have not opened. It sat somewhere behind my sternum, and it did not go away, and when I was doing something with my hands, it would come up, and I would put it back down. On the 19th of July, it happened again. An outfitted trip, 17 people, boatmen who had run that river for 20 years, at Little Soldier Camp at mile 52. They came around the bend at 4 in the afternoon, and there was smoke on the beach. They landed anyway, because they were professionals, and because there were 17 people, and however many there might be on that beach, it was not going to be more than 17. And by the time they got the first boat in, there was nobody there. The head boatman was a man I knew. His name was Ellery Voss, and I had rowed for him for 2 seasons out of Salmon, and he was the least excitable human being I have ever met. He is the kind of man who tells you the boat is wrapped in the same voice he tells you what is for lunch. Ellery got on the radio at 6 that evening, and he did not use the word strange, and he did not use the word odd. He said, "Deal, somebody had a fire going at Little Soldier this afternoon, and left it going and walked away, and I have put it out, and I want you to write down what I am about to tell you." He said, "The wood in that fire was dry cottonwood split small, and it was stacked in the ring in a square, 4 and 4, and it was set with a fire pan under it." A fire pan? A metal tray, required by regulation on that river since the 80s, so that nobody leaves a scar in the sand. You do not carry a fire pan into the wilderness on your back. It is a piece of gear for a boat, Ellery said, and there is a rock at the top of that beach where the sand goes to gravel, and there is a place scraped out beside it, and there is a piece of 1/2-inch line tied around the rock, and the tail of it goes into the water. He said, "I pulled it up." He said, "There is a net bag on the end of it with 4 cans of pears in it." He said, "They are cold." I stood on the porch at Indian Creek with the mic in my hand and the sun going orange up the canyon, and I did not say anything for so long that Ellery keyed up again and said, "Deal." I said, "Is it a camp you are assigned?" He said, "It is." I said, "Was anybody assigned to Little Soldier last night?" There was a pause while a man who has run a river for 20 years looked at his own copy of the sheet. He said, "No. It shows open." He said, "Deal, it has shown open for 3 nights." The camp assignment sheet is the most boring document on the Middle Fork of the Salmon, and it is also the only thing on that river that anybody would call intelligence. It is made every morning at Boundary Creek. The launch ranger takes the parties going out that day, and their trip lengths and their preferences, and he works it against the parties already on the water, and he writes out a grid. Down the left side, every camp on the river in order, 60 some of them. Across the top, the next 6 nights. In the boxes, the party names. Then he reads it over the radio at 8:15 in the morning to Indian Creek and to the Flying Bee and to the office in Chalice, and every one of us copies it onto our own sheet. And mine went on a clipboard, on a nail, on the porch post, and every one of the boatmen out there had a copy of the piece of it that concerned him, penciled on the back of a river map in a dry bag. That is the whole system. It is a beautiful system. It has never failed in 50 years. And what it is, if you turn it over and look at the back of it, is a document that tells you exactly which places on 100 miles of river will have nobody in them tonight and tomorrow night and every night for 6 days out. Most of the camps are empty most of the time. That is what nobody thinks about, because you are looking at the boxes with names in them. There are 60-some camps, and there are 7 parties. 53 of those boxes are blank. Blank means no permit. Blank means no head count. Blank means no radio, no boat, no fire pan check, and nobody coming around the bend at 4 in the afternoon. Blank means, for that night, no human being will be at that place. And every morning at 8:15, a man with a good voice reads the whole of it out over an open channel on a frequency that any handheld radio bought at a sporting goods store can hear. And a ranger at mile 25 writes it on a clipboard and hangs the clipboard on a nail. I did not think any of that in July. I want to be honest about my own slowness. I thought it in September, sitting on the floor of the cabin, and by then it was too late to think it. In July, what I did was go down under the cabin. The Indian Creek Station is a plank cabin on posts. It sits about 2.5 feet off the ground on cedar blocks because in a big water year the creek comes up over that bar and takes the whole flat, and it has been rebuilt twice for that reason. Under the floor there is a crawl space with a skirt of boards around it and a hatch on the creek side, and under there is where the station keeps the things that nobody has thrown away since 1960. I went under there because I wanted the old station logs. I did not have a theory. I had a thing behind my sternum, and I wanted to see whether any other man in a green shirt had ever written 9 words in a logbook about an unassigned camper. The crawl space is low. You go in on your belly, and you turn onto your side and you work along on an elbow. It smells like dry dust and mouse, and the cold underside of a plank. The logs were in 2 ammo cans and a milk crate. I dragged them out into the daylight, and I sat on the porch steps in the sun, and I went through 14 years of the most boring writing that has ever been done by a human hand. Water levels, weather, aircraft, bear in camp, hazed, bear in camp, hazed, party reports lost ore at pistol, party requests medical, wasp sting, advised, toilet vault pumped. I found 2 entries that were not that. The first was in a log from 8 seasons back, in a hand I did not know, and it said, Cove Camp, ash warm, no party assigned. Second time. Whoever wrote it had never written the first time down. The second one was 6 pages further on, and it said, Hiker at Marble would not give name, headed downriver, packing light, cannot account. That was all. That season's log ran to the end of September, and there was nothing else, and the man who wrote it signed the last page in a small hand, Ost. I sat on those steps, and I said the name to myself. Warren Ost had been the ranger at Indian Creek for 6 seasons, and he had left the year before I took the post, and the reason he left, according to everybody in Salmon who had ever told me anything about him, was that he had a bad back and he took a desk and chalice and then he quit that too. I had met him once. He came through Boundary Creek the spring I got hired, and somebody pointed him out to me across the lot and said, That is the man whose beat you were getting, and I walked over and put my hand out and he shook it. He said, Congratulations. I said something like, I hoped I could do half as well, 'cause I was 30 and I was stupid. And Warren Ost looked at me for a second longer than the sentence required, and he said, You will be fine. It is a quiet job. Then he got in his truck. I went back under the cabin. Not for the logs. The logs were out on the porch. I went back under, 'cause I had crawled over something on my way in and it had not registered, the way a thing does not register when you are on your belly in the dark with a headlamp on your forehead and your mind on ammo cans. Under the middle of the floor, in the deepest part of the crawl space, where the dirt is packed and dry and where a man can lie on his back with about 8 inches between his chest and the floor joists, the ground is smooth, not swept, worn. It is worn the way a door sill is worn. It is an oval, maybe 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, and the dust does not lie in it the way the dust lies everywhere else under there. The whole rest of that crawl space is a soft gray felt of 50 years of dust and mouse. That oval is packed dirt with a shine on it. I lay down in it. I did not decide to. I was on my elbow looking at it, and then I was on my back in it, and my shoulders fit it, and my heels fit it, and I was looking up at the underside of the floor of the cabin where I'd been living for 4 summers. There is a gap between the porch and the main floor where the joists change direction. Through that gap you can see a line of daylight, and the daylight is the crack between the last floorboard and the porch board. I lay in that oval, and I looked up through that crack, and what I could see through it was the underside of the porch post. And the nail, and the corner of the clipboard hanging on the nail, 6 inches above my face and 1 board away. I lay there a long time. I could hear the creek. I could hear planes somewhere up the canyon, a long way off. Coming or going, it does not matter. And I said to myself, out loud, in a crawl space, under a ranger station at mile 25 of the middle fork of the Salmon, Bergstrom Party 6, Pungo tonight, Whitey Cox tomorrow. I heard my own voice come back down through the boards. I called Chalice that afternoon, and I told them there was evidence of a person living under the Indian Creek station. They sent a law enforcement ranger out on the mail plane 4 days later. His name was Tapp, and he was maybe 27, and he was polite, and he was thorough. He went under there with a good light, and he was under there 20 minutes, and he came out with dust in his eyebrows. He said, "It is a wallow," he said. "Porcupine, most likely. Could be a coyote. Something has been laying up under there for a long time, and it has packed the dirt." I said, "It is 6 feet long." He said, "Dirt does not measure like you think it does, in the dark." He looked at me for a second, and I watched a young man decide, correctly and reasonably, and on the basis of everything he knew, that a seasonal ranger who had been alone on a beach for 4 summers had gotten a little strange, and that the kindest thing was to write nothing down. He said, "Are you sleeping all right out here?" I said, "Sure." He wrote it up as a wildlife den, and he recommended skirting the crawl space with hardware cloth, and that recommendation went into a file, and the next spring somebody actually did it. I flew out on my week off on the 2nd of August, and I drove down to Salmon, and I found Warren Ost. It was not hard. Salmon has 3,000 people. He was in a rental on the north end, a single wide, with a ramp built up to the door and a garden that was better than the house, and he was sitting on a bucket in that garden at 10 in the morning with a hoe across his knees. He was maybe 60. He looked at me coming across the yard, and he knew, and I watched him know, and he did not get up. He said, "Which camp?" I stopped walking. He said, "That is not fair of me. Sit down. There is another bucket." We sat in his garden for 4 hours. His wife brought coffee out twice and did not stay. Warren Ost had been at Indian Creek for 6 seasons, and he had noticed the fires in his second one. He did what a careful man does, which is he kept the sheets. You are supposed to burn them. It is not a rule so much as a habit. They are working paper, and at the end of a season you have got 100 and something pages of a grid with names in it, and no reason on earth to keep one. Ost kept every one. 6 seasons. He kept them because in his second season he wrote a note in a margin, and then 2 weeks later he wanted to look at the note again. He kept them in a footlocker, and the footlocker was in the shed behind the single wide, and he went and got it, and he set it down in the dirt of the garden, and he opened it, and there they were, in bundles with rubber bands that had gone to tar. He had gone through them with a pencil, every blank box on every sheet, all 6 seasons, and next to certain of them he had made a tick. A tick meant a report. Not a report to anybody. A report to him. Somebody radioed in that there was ash at Cove that should not have been there. Somebody at Little Soldier found a fire pan. Somebody at Sheep Creek came around the corner and there was a man on the beach, and by the time they landed he was gone. 26 ticks in 6 seasons. He had laid the sheets out on his kitchen table one winter. All of them. And he had done the only thing that was left to do, which was to read the ticks in order by date instead of by camp. He put a finger on the first bundle and he showed me, and it took me about 4 minutes to see it, and when I saw it, my hands went cold in the sun. The ticks moved downstream, not fast. 6 or 8 miles a night on the nights he moved, and then he would sit for 3 or 4 nights in one place, and then he would move again. Boundary to Cache Bar in about 4 weeks, which is 4 times as long as it takes a boat, and about right for a man on foot who does not want to be on the trail in daylight. And then, for a stretch of about 9 or 10 days, no ticks anywhere, and then the ticks would start again at the top. Ost said, "He floats down and he walks back up." I said, "Walks back up how?" He said, "The trail. The trail is right there. It runs the whole west side. He does it in the dark, and there is nobody on it, and he has done it enough times that he does not need a light. He said, 4 times a summer, give or take. I said, floats. There is no boat. And Warren Oss said, there does not have to be a boat. He said, that river will carry a man in a life jacket from Marble to Little Soldier in 3 hours. It is not sport. It is not fun. It is cold, and it will beat him, and it is the single most dangerous thing a person can do on that water. And nobody, not one ranger, and not one boatman on the Middle Fork of the Salmon, has ever once in their life stood on a beach and looked at the river and thought, is there a man in it? He said, we look at the boats. He said, I have thought about it for 8 years, and I do not know how many summers he has been doing it, and I do not think anybody could tell you. I asked him the thing. I said, what does he want? Ost picked up his hoe and turned it over in his hands. He said, he wants what everybody wants. He wants a place with a fire ring and flat sand and a spring and no wind, which is what a camp is, which is why they are camps, and every one of them has been a camp for a very long time. He said the sheep eaters wintered in some of those same spots. There are pictographs at Vale and there are pits at Cove, and every one of those beaches has been the good place on that piece of river since before there was anybody to write it down. He said, we did not build those camps. We named them. We put them on a sheet, and we handed the sheet out, and we told 60 or 70 people a day where to go and what night to be there. He said, and if you were living in that canyon, and you had been living in it a long time, and then one year a man began reading you a list every night of exactly where they would all be sleeping and exactly where they would not tell me what you would do with that list. I said, I would use it to stay away from them. Ost said, that is what I said too, for 4 years. He said, and then I sat down with the sheets one winter, and I laid the ticks against the assignments, and I found out that he does not stay away from them. He said, he is always one camp ahead, every single time. In 6 seasons of ticks, there is not one exception. The camp he is in tonight is the camp that gets a party in it tomorrow night. He said, he is not avoiding us. He said, he is waiting where we are going to be, and he leaves before we get there, and he does it every night of the summer. And he has never taken one thing, and he has never touched one person, and there is not one law in the state of Idaho that he is breaking except a camping permit. Then Warren Ost asked me the question that I have never been able to get out from under. He said, how do you get the sheet? I said, they read it at 8:15. He said, no. How do you get it? What do you do with it? I said, I write it on a clipboard. He said, and where do you keep the clipboard? I said, on a nail on the porch post. He said, and then what do you do? And I sat on a bucket in a garden in Salmon, Idaho in August, and I heard myself say, out loud, in a voice that came from a long way off. I read it. At night, before I go in, he said, out loud. I said, out loud. Warren Oss put his coffee down on the ground beside his boot, and he put both hands over his face, and he sat there like that for a while. Then he said, how long? I said, 4 seasons. He told me the rest of it in pieces, and it took the afternoon. In his 4th season, Ost worked out that the man was reading the clipboard. He worked it out from the ticks. The camps in the upper river above Indian Creek were hit at random, 4 or 5 a season. The camps below Indian Creek were hit right, every time, always one night ahead of the party. Everything above his beach was a guess, everything below it was a schedule. So Ost stopped hanging the clipboard on the nail. He took it inside and he put it in the drawer of the desk, and he wrote the assignments into the station log, and he did not leave paper on a porch post. He did it on the 11th of June. On the 14th he came out at dawn to a fire ring on the Indian Creek beach, in the sand, 40 feet from the porch, with a fire pan under it, and gray ash in it, and the smell still on the air. Nothing was taken. Nothing was touched. The John boat was where he left it. The door of the cabin had not been opened, and he would have known, because he had run a thread across it, which is a thing a man does when he has been alone on a beach for 4 summers. He said, I stood there and looked at that ash, and I understood that I had taken something away from somebody who had it long before I ever got there. He said, I put the clipboard back on the nail that night. I did not say anything. He said, go ahead. I said nothing. He said, say it. I have said it to myself 6,000 times. I said, you gave him the sheet. Ost said, yes. He said, I gave him the sheet for 2 more seasons because when he has the sheet, he is 30 miles from me, and when he does not have the sheet, he is on my beach. He said, and I told myself a very good story about it, and the story was that he never hurt anybody, and that was true, and that it was better for everybody if he knew where the boats were going to be so he could be somewhere else, and that was also true, and I have never in my life told myself 2 truer things in a row in order to do a thing that I knew was wrong. Then he told me why he quit. In his last season, in the last week of August, an outfitter had a mechanical problem at Boundary and launched a day late, and the whole schedule below them shifted, and the launch ranger rewrote 3 days of the grid and read the corrections at 8:15 in the morning. Ost copied the corrections onto the clipboard and hung it on the nail. He got the correction wrong. 1 box. He put a party of two women in a raft at Sheep Creek on the wrong night. On his sheet, on the nail, Sheep Creek was blank on the 29th. On the actual river, on the actual 29th, they were there. He said she called it in at 4 in the morning. She had gotten up and she was standing at the water because that is where you go. And she turned around and there was a man at the top of the beach in the dark, not 10 yards from her, standing still, facing the tent. She said he did not come toward her. She said he did not run. She said he looked at her for a second and then he walked up the beach into the rocks the way a man walks into his own kitchen. She said, and this is the thing Ost repeated twice, she said, he looked surprised. Ost said, of course he was surprised. Of course he was. He had read the sheet. He had done what he does every night of his life, which is walk into a place that is empty, and the sheet said it was empty, and it was not. And it was not because I copied a box wrong at 8:15 in the morning, he said, and I have sat with that for 4 years, and I still do not know which part of it is the part that keeps me up. He said, I got in my truck the next week, and I drove to Chalice, and I took the desk job, and I never went back down that river, and I never told the man who took my beach one single thing about it, and I want you to understand why. He said, because if I told him, he would take the clipboard off the nail. I flew back in on the 8th of August, and I stood on that beach and looked at the porch post. The nail was a 16-penny common driven at a slight upward angle so a clipboard would not slide off, and it was worn bright, and it had been driven a long time ago by somebody who was probably dead. I hung the clipboard on it. I want to be able to tell you that I hung it there because I had decided something, but that would give me more credit than I have got coming. I hung it there because that is where it goes. Before I did anything else, I walked the trail. I went at night because that was the point. I left at 11 on the 10th of August with a small pack, and I went up the west side toward Boundary with my light off, and I walked until 3 in the morning, and I made about 9 miles. It can be done. That is the plain answer, and I got it in the first hour. The Middle Fork Trail above Indian Creek is a good trail, a stock trail, 20 inches wide and graded, and the moon was 2/3, and the canyon walls give you a black line to hold to on one side, and the sound of the water on the other, and a man who had walked it 200 times would not need a light at all. He would need it 4 or 5 times at the slides. There are 3 slides in those 9 miles where the trail crosses raw rock and the tread goes to nothing. At the second one there is a hand line. It is half-inch line, gray, sun-killed, a section of it may be 40 feet long, run through 2 lengths of rebar that have been driven into cracks in the rock and bent over. There is an eye splice at one end, laid up by hand, 5 tucks, the tail whipped with wax twine. It is not agency work. Agency work has a tag on it and a work order behind it, and I could tell you the name of the man who would have done it. It is old. The rebar has bled, a rust stain down that rock a foot wide. I stood at that slide at 1 in the morning with my hand on a rope that somebody spliced, and I ran my thumb up the standing part, and about 6 feet up from the eye there is a place where the line is worn down to about 1/3 of its diameter. On the underside, the way a rope wears when a hand pulls on it in the same spot 10,000 times. I went another 2 miles and I found the second thing. A cottonwood came down across the trail in a high water year, and it is a big one, and the agency has never cut it, because that is 30 miles from a road and there is no crew and no reason. You go around it, everybody goes around it, up the bank, and the go-around is beaten into the dirt by every horse and every hunter and every backpacker for 15 years. At the root wad end, on the riverside, where there is no reason for anybody to be, there is a second path. It is not beaten, it is worn. There is a difference, and I did not know there was a difference until I was standing on one at 1:30 in the morning. A beaten path is churned. A worn path is smooth, the way a stair is smooth, and there is nothing loose on it, and the stones that would roll under a foot have been taken out of it and set to the side in a line, one at a time, over a very long time. It ran along under the root wad and came back up to the trail 80 yards on, and it saved him about 40 seconds. And I turned around and went back. I got in at 4:10. I came down the last stretch of trail above the station with the sky just beginning to go gray up the canyon, and I stopped about 30 yards out because I had left the lamp on in the cabin. The window threw a yellow rectangle out onto the porch boards, and in it, hanging on a 16-penny nail on the porch post, was a white sheet of paper on a brown clipboard, lit up like a page in a church. And I stood on that trail in the dark, and I read the top 3 lines of it from 30 yards away without any trouble at all. I ran the rest of that season, and I did the job. I checked permits, and I counted heads, and I hazed a bear out of the corral, and I sewed up a boatman's eyebrow with 2 stitches and a headlamp in my teeth. And every night, at about 10:15, I stood on the porch, and I took the clipboard off the nail, and I said the names out loud. I did not change one word of it, not one, because I had run the arithmetic on Warren Ost's kitchen table, and it came out the same for me as it came out for him, and it comes out this way. There are between 40 and 80 people on that river on any night in July. There is one of me. And there is a document, and if he does not have the document, he does not know where they are, and if he does not know where they are, he has to go and look. I did the thing I did for the same reason he did it, and I would not swear that I would do different now. And every time I say that out loud to somebody who has never been down there, they look at me like I have told them. I set a trap for a child. In the middle of September, the season goes quiet. The permit season ends on the 7th, and after that the river is open, and there is almost nobody on it. The nights get cold. The cottonwoods at Indian Creek go yellow all at once, in about 4 days, like a lamp coming up. The last week I was there, the sheet was empty. Not blanks in a grid, empty. There was no 8:15 call, there was no launch, there was nobody between me and the main, and nobody above me either. I took the clipboard off the nail on the last night, the 22nd of September, and there was nothing written on it, and I stood on that porch in the cold, with a headlamp on the red setting and a piece of blank paper in my hands. And I stood there a good long while, and I could not make myself say it, because there was only one thing left to say, and it was that every camp on 100 miles of river was open, and that there was nobody anywhere, and that the only human being between Boundary Creek and Cache Bar was standing on a porch at mile 25 reading it to him. I went inside, and I did not sleep. At about 4 in the morning I heard a board. Not under me. Not the porch. It was the 3rd board in from the door, the one that has always been loose, the one I stepped over without thinking 11 times a day for 4 seasons, and it went down about 1/4 of an inch and it came back up, the way it does when weight comes off it, inside the cabin. I lay on that bunk with my eyes open in the dark for what I have since worked out was somewhere over 2 hours, and nothing else happened, and nothing else moved. And at daylight I got up, and the door was closed, and the thread I had run across it 3 nights before was lying on the floor. There was a fire ring on the beach, not in the fire ring that is always there. A new one, 40 feet from the porch, in the sand, rocks set in a circle, cold, with dry cottonwood split small and stacked in it in a square, 4 and 4, and no ash, because it had never been lit. It was laid and it was ready and it had not been lit. and I have thought about that ever since. I went and got the John boat. I do not know what I meant to do with it. It is a 14-foot aluminum thing with a small outboard on it, and it is for pulling somebody off a rock, and it will not go anywhere upstream except the 50 yards of flat water in front of the beach. And I ran it up that 50 yards in the gray light with the motor idling, and I sat there in the current with my hand on the tiller, and I looked at the canyon wall. Nothing looked at me. Nothing ever has. That is the piece of it that outsiders never believe. In 11 seasons I have never seen him. Not a shape, not a light, not once. I have seen his ash, and I have handled his rope, and I have lain in the hollow, his back wore in the ground under my own floor. I have heard one board. I let the boat drift back down onto the beach, and I sat in it while it grounded, and the aluminum went bump on the sand, and I sat there until the sun came over the east rim and hit the cottonwoods. And then I got out, and I pulled it up, and I went and made coffee, because there is nothing else in the world to do at 6 in the morning at mile 25. A camp is a place where the wood is already split. That is what a camp is, if you go back far enough. Not a reservation, not a box on a grid. It is a piece of flat sand out of the wind with a spring behind it, and when you leave one, you split wood for the next person, and you stack it in the ring, and you go on down the river. Everybody used to do that. My grandfather did it. There are men still alive on the Salmon who do it. It went out of style about the time we started handing out fire pans. I do not know what he meant by it. I have 3 ideas, and they cannot all be true. One is that it was a courtesy. A man had lived under my floor for years, and the season was over, and he came up into the cabin and stood over me while I lay awake. And then he went out and did the one thing that people in that country used to do for each other, and he did not light it because it was not his to light. One is that it was a demonstration. I could have. Here is how close. And one is that it was neither, that it was nothing. That after a long time alone, a man does the things his hands know how to do, and his hands knew how to lay a fire on a beach at Indian Creek. And so they laid one. I flew out on the 24th of September, and I went to Salmon, and Warren Ost's wife told me at the door that he had gone to Boise for a procedure and that he was doing all right, and that she would tell him I came by. He died the following March. It was his heart, and it was nothing to do with any of this, and I have never once let myself pretend otherwise. She called me and asked me if I wanted anything of his, and I said the footlocker in the shed, and she said, "Take it." And she stood in the yard with her arms crossed while I put it in the truck, and she said, "He never said one word to me about that river in 20 years. I went back for a 5th season. I want to be as plain about that as I can. I was 38 years old. I had no wife and no children, and I had a truck and a storage unit in Salmon with a couch in it that I had not bought. There was a job in Riggins, running a shuttle. There was a job with the state. I went back to the beach. The first thing I did when I got in was hang the clipboard on the nail. In June of that 5th season, I did the only experiment I have ever done in my life. The launch ranger read the sheet at 8:15 on the 11th, and I copied it down. And there was a party of 9 from Colorado going into Sheep Creek on the 12th, and Hyde Creek, 4 miles below it, was blank. I wrote Hyde Creek down as occupied. I wrote a name in the box. I made it up. I made up a party of 6 out of Twin Falls, and I gave them a name that sounded like a name, and I hung the clipboard on the nail. And at 10:15 that night, I stood on that porch under the moths, and I read the whole sheet out loud in the exact voice I always use. And I read the Twin Falls party into Hyde Creek on the 12th, and I hung the board back up, and I went inside. Then I got on the radio the next afternoon to the boatman on the Colorado trip, a woman I trusted, and I asked her to do me a favor that I could not explain, which was to walk down and look at Hyde Creek on her way past. She called me from Little Creek that evening. She said, "There is nobody at Hyde." She said, "There is not so much as a footprint." She said, "And it is a nice camp, and it is open, and I do not know why you would not let somebody use it." 4 miles below her, At a camp I invented in my head, standing on a porch, there was nothing. And a mile above her, at Cave Camp, which was blank on the real sheet and blank on my sheet, the party behind her found gray ash and a place scraped out beside a rock. I sat on the bunk in that cabin, and I put my head in my hands, because that was the whole of it. That was the experiment, and it worked. And there is not one other explanation for the result. He does not watch the boats. He does not know a thing about the Colorado party, or where they are, or how many they have, or when they will come around the bend. He knows what I tell him. He has known it for at least 15 years, which is as far back as the ticks go, which is only as far back as somebody started making ticks. And there is no crime. That is the thing I have never been able to hand to anybody, and I have tried twice. There is no crime. He has never taken a thing. He has never touched a person. He camps without a permit in a wilderness that has no boundary he has ever crossed, and he moves at night, and he leaves the woods split. Tap, the young law enforcement ranger, made supervisor, and then he left the agency. I never brought it to him again. I have been on that beach for 11 seasons now. The cottonwoods have gotten bigger. They put hardware cloth around the crawl space that first winter, like the report said. And in the spring there was a place at the back corner where somebody had rolled it up neat in a tube and tied it with a piece of half-inch line and set it against the post. I have never looked to see whether the oval under the floor is still packed and shining. I keep Ost's footlocker under the bunk. My own sheets go in it at the end of every season with rubber bands around them, 11 seasons of them, and I have gone through them with a pencil, and there are 41 ticks in 11 years, and they move downstream, and then they stop, and then they start again at the top. I have never told a soul at the agency. I have never told a boatman. I have told exactly one person, and she was a woman I saw for a while in Chalice, and she listened to the whole thing, and she did not laugh, and about 3 weeks later, she stopped answering the phone, and I do not blame her, and I would not have known what to do with me either. I am not going to say what I think he is. Warren Ost never said. That was the discipline of the man, and it took me years to see it as discipline. There have been people in that canyon since before there was a canyon. There were homesteads in there when the government drew the line around it, and there were men who did not come out. There are still 4 or 5 in holdings back in that country, and I have flown over every one of them. He could be somebody's grandson. He could be somebody who walked in over Marble Creek in 1970 and did not walk out. He could be a man who is younger than me. I do not think about that. I really do not. What I think about is a piece of paper. There is a document made every morning at 8:15 at Boundary Creek by a man with a clean shirt and a good voice, and it says where every human being on 100 miles of river will lay their head tonight, and it says in 53 blank boxes where nobody will be. Nobody built that document to hide anything. Nobody thought of it as anything at all. It is a scheduling tool. It exists so that 2 families do not have to share a beach, and it works, and every ranger and every boatman on that water would tell you it is the best thing the agency ever did. It took somebody in that canyon a long time to understand what it was. Longer than it took me, and he had less to go on. He had a voice on a beach at night, and a piece of paper on a nail, and no map of the whole thing, and no way to ask anybody, and he worked it out the way a man works out weather over years, by being wrong and coming back. He got there. He got there before Warren Ost did, and he got there before I did. And it is a beautiful system. It has never failed in 50 years. Nobody has ever been hurt because of it. It keeps the beaches quiet, and it keeps the parties spread out, and it is a kindness to everybody who ever floated that water. And every night I take it off a nail on a porch post, and I stand in the dark on a beach at mile 25 with a red light on my head, and I read it out loud. Bergstrom Party, Idaho Afloat, the 2 brothers in the hard shell kayaks, Marble Creek, Sheep Creek, Cove, Wilson, Ouzel, Survey, 52 people. 7 parties, 100 miles, everybody in a bed. Then I hang the board back on the nail where he can reach it, and I go inside, and I shut a door that has never had a lock worth the wood it is set in, and I lie down on a bunk with 3/4 of an inch of pine between my back and the ground. And I listen to the creek, and I do not move for a long time.